Picture yourself standing on the quiet cobbled streets of Kyoto, bathed in the soft glow of lantern light. The air is crisp, the kind of cool evening breeze that whispers through the trees and carries the faint scent of incense wafting from the tea houses that line the narrow alley. The city, once a bustling capital of feudal Japan, feels still and almost timeless as night falls. Beneath the lantern light, the elegant shimmer of silk kimonos catches your eye. Women glide silently across the streets, their presence an aura of grace and mystery. These women, the geishas, represent an ideal of refinement. Their very existence, a living testament to centuries of Japanese culture. As they move through the shadows, their faces painted white with red and black accents, they carry with them a legacy of artistic mastery and sacrificial dedication. The beauty of their dance, the subtle elegance of their tea ceremonies, and the skill with which they engage their patrons in quiet conversation, all seem effortless. Yet beneath the porcelain facade lies a life marked not only by artistic achievement, but by rigorous discipline, and a world that requires constant. Imagine the quiet hum of conversation from within the tea, the sounds of shamisen strings softly playing in the background, harmonizing with the rustling of kimono fabric. These gentle sounds are contrasted with the stillness of the night and the focus of the geisha, each one poised and trained, ready to perform for the patrons, who come seeking not just beauty but the ephemeral charm of something deeper. This world of geishas is, at first glance, one of aesthetic perfection, but, as we will see, it is a world defined by sacrifice and restraint. The geisha's life is not simply the sum of her artistic talents. It is a carefully constructed balance between grace and discipline, freedom and constraint, art and sacrifice. This dichotomy lies at the heart of the geisha's experience, the constant tension between social expectation and the personal cost required to maintain the status and identity of the perfect entertainer. The story of the geisha begins in the Edo period, a time when Japan was sealed off from the rest of the world, allowing its internal society and culture to develop and flourish in relative isolation. The Edo period, a time of relative peace and stability, saw the flowering of arts and entertainment, as the samurai class and merchant society became the key figures in urban life. This was when the geisha tradition, as we know it, began to take form. Initially, the geisha were male entertainers, but by the 18th century, this role transitioned to a female-dominated profession, one that would come to symbolize a unique intersection of art, culture, and entertainment. The geisha's role in society was far from simple. They were not just dancers or musicians. They were artists, cultural ambassadors, and in many ways, the idealized representation of Japan's traditional aesthetic values. Over time, they became an integral part of Japan's high society, offering their services to wealthy patrons, often samurai, merchants, and other influential figures. But beyond their roles as entertainers, they held a deeper position in society. Geishas were seen as women who had mastered the finest traditions of classical arts, from the subtle melodies of the shamisen to the careful rituals of the tea ceremony. The process to become a geisha was rigorous, requiring years of dedication, discipline, and a relentless pursuit of artistic mastery. However, while they were revered for their skills, their lives were often misunderstood or romanticized. To the public, geishas were the epitome of beauty, mystery, and elegance, idealized images of Japanese femininity. But beneath the graceful exterior of the geisha lay a life bound by strict societal codes. Their lives were governed by patronage systems, where their personal autonomy was often subordinated to the needs and demands of the wealthy men who frequented the. As geishas became symbols of refined culture, the world they inhabited was also one of constant expectation, ritual, and performance. Their art, while deeply tied to Japan as traditional values, was also a delicate act of balancing between the pursuit of personal happiness and the requirements of their role. To be a geisha was to be much more than an entertainer. The geisha was a woman whose entire life revolved around the mastery of traditional arts. From the delicate movements of the tea ceremony to the mesmerizing beauty of her dance, every aspect of a geisha's existence was shaped by discipline, self-restraint, and a commitment to preserving the cultural heritage of Japan. The core of a geisha's life was not just her ability to entertain, but her ability to embody the cultural heart of Japan. As a geisha, she was expected to serve as a living repository of tradition, offering patrons not only art but also a glimpse into the spiritual essence of Japan. She was a master of conversation, skilled at navigating the subtle dynamics of social interaction, knowing when to speak, when to listen, and how to create a sense of intimacy through the art of quiet expression. But as beautiful as it may sound, the reality of being a geisha was far from glamorous. Beneath the outer layers of elegance lay a grueling pursuit of perfection. Each step, each gesture, each note on the shama song, and each word spoken had been carefully cultivated and practiced for years. A geisha's life was a constant balancing act between personal sacrifice and the need to please her patrons. The geisha's social status was deeply tied to her art, but the demand for perfection could weigh heavily on her. While patrons came to the tea house to experience the refinement and entertainment that a geisha could offer, they were often blind to the years of hardship and sacrifice that had shaped the woman in front of them. For a geisha, freedom was something to be quietly sought, for the world she inhabited was one of constant expectation. To succeed in this world was to relinquish certain freedoms, to bend one's life around the needs of others, and to never cease striving for artistic perfection. The path to becoming a geisha was never a simple one. Imagine, if you will, a young girl, perhaps only 6 or 7 years old, standing at the threshold of a life that would be shaped entirely by the rigorous world of geisha training. The decision to enter the world of the geisha was monumental. It marked the beginning of a journey, filled with both prestige and sacrifice. The entrance into this world often began in the OCA houses, where young girls scored Mako during their apprenticeship began their intensive training. The process was often formative, shaping the girl not just into an entertainer, but into someone who would be both an artist and a cultural icon. This was no ordinary childhood, no ordinary education. It was a life focused on discipline, self-control, and perfection. The first step into becoming a geisha began with a selection process. Young girls were chosen, often by families or matchmakers, to enter these tea. For many families, especially those in the lower or middle class, sending a daughter into the geisha world was seen as an opportunity for prestige and social mobility. It was an honor to serve as a geisha, as they held a unique place in society, not just as entertainers, but as bearers of cultural tradition and artistic refinement. Yet, this honor came at a steep cost. Life in the geisha world demanded sacrifice and unwavering commitment. For the young girls who entered the world of geishas, their lives were no longer their own. From the very beginning, they were stripped of the freedom that most children took for granted. The choice to enter the Oche house was often not entirely their own, but rather a family decision or one dictated by circumstance. As such, many girls were raised with the knowledge that their path in life would revolve around service and artistry, leaving little room for personal desires or aspirations outside of their training. The first few years in the tea house were akin to a life of rigorous apprenticeship, where the Mako began learning the art of hospitality and the delicate balance of being both a performer and a social figure. They learned how to serve guests with grace, how to entertain with charm, and how to create an air of mystery that captivated their audience. But most of all, they learned the importance of discipline, as every action from the way they moved. The selection of a Mako was not random. It was an intricate process steeped in tradition. A girl's family background, appearance, and temperament were all considered when choosing her for the role. However, one of the most important factors was the desire to succeed in the demanding world of geishas. Geishas were expected to uphold the highest levels of elegance, dignity, and cultural knowledge. As such, only those who demonstrated an inherent discipline and dedication to the craft were deemed suitable. It was a decision that changed the life of the girl and her family forever. In many cases, once a girl entered the tea house to begin her training, she would be expected to stay there for much of her young life. The young apprentice was often bound by contracts that required years of service in exchange for training in the traditional arts. During these years, her personal freedom was replaced with a life focused entirely on mastering the skills of her craft. The pressure on young girls to succeed as geishas was immense. Each girl would be assigned a mentor or mother, who was often a more senior geisha tasked with ensuring that the apprentice's training was conducted according to the highest standards. This was not a world for the faint of heart. Apprentices were expected to work tirelessly, practicing their skills in dance, tea ceremonies, shamisen music, and other traditional arts. For the girls who entered the Oche houses, there was little room for personal choice or rebellion. Their lives were carefully curated to ensure that every aspect of their persona was aligned with the ideal of the geisha, poised and able to captivate an audience with ease. Yet, despite this prestige, the life of a geisha was filled with harsh realities. From the moment they entered their training, these girls were expected to commit to a life of selflessness. Each day was marked by hours of practice, whether that involved learning the delicate steps of a traditional dance, the sophisticated plucking of a shamisen string, or the meticulous preparation of tea. These early years were often isolating and intense, leaving little room for outside interactions or distractions. Imagine the isolation of these young girls, as they spent their formative years away from their families and friends. In some cases, they would be sent away to live in the tea house, where their world was defined by the strict schedule of lessons, performances, and duties. It was not uncommon for these young apprentices to long for the simpler pleasures of childhood, playing with friends, attending school, and dreaming of a different life. Yet, the world of the geisha offered no such comforts. The rigorous training also meant that the emotional and physical toll on the girls was significant. Early on, they would be taught how to suppress their natural reactions, how to control their emotions, and how to maintain a composed and mysterious demeanor at all times. The world of a geisha was one of performance, and this performance extended beyond the stage. It permeated every aspect of the mako's life. Even her interactions with patrons were structured to maintain the illusion of grace and refinement, regardless of the personal feelings or desires she might have. The intense nature of the geisha world created a unique blend of artistic mastery and sacrifice. These young girls were expected to perfect their craft and contribute to the legacy of the geisha tradition, but at a great personal cost. Their individuality, while encouraged in terms of artistic expression, was still constrained by the heavy weight of social expectations and the unyielding desire for perfection. They were not just artists, they were living symbols of an ideal that demanded constant attention, dedication, and, often, a lifetime of service. Once selected, the training began immediately. It started with the basics, the art of walking gracefully in a kimono, a garment that was often cumbersome and restrictive. At first, the young mako would struggle to maintain balance and poise as they learned to move with the stiff, layered fabric of the kimono weighing them down. The oba, thick belt wrapped tightly around the waist, was designed to hold the kimono in place, but also served as a reminder of the discipline required. The shamisen, a traditional three-stringed instrument, became the next focus of their training, learning to pluck the strings with precision, to follow the rhythm of traditional music, and to use the instrument to enhance the dance performances required hours of practice each day. The shamisen was more than an instrument. It was an extension of the geisha's soul, creating a connection between the mind, the body, and the art they were trying to perfect. In addition to dance and music, the young apprentices learned the art of conversation, a skill that required the ability to entertain, listen, and remain poised in the company of others. The tea ceremony, a ritual of meditative grace, was an essential part of their training. In the ceremony, the focus was on humility, simplicity, and the ability to create an atmosphere of serenity for the guests. The journey into the world of the geisha began at a young age for many girls. Imagine the moment a girl, no older than 6 or 7, steps through the sliding doors of the oche house, the tea house that will become both her home and her school. Here, the path ahead will be one of unyielding discipline, artistic mastery, and societal expectation. It is a world where grace and poise are not just encouraged but expected, where the very essence of Japanese cultural traditions is passed down through the gestures of a young girl, one step, one movement, one note at a time. The decision to enter this world wasn't an easy one. For many, it was a decision made by family or circumstance, often influenced by the desire to bring prestige to a family through the geisha's social standing. The girls who entered this world often did so with little more than a sense of duty. They were not just learning an art form, they were preparing to serve as cultural ambassadors, masters of social etiquette, and entertainers whose performances transcended mere beauty, embodying the spiritual essence of Japan. But to become such an icon required years of strict discipline, sacrifice, and perfection. The first taste of the life of a geisha was the apprenticeship phase, where the young girls became mako the apprentice, geisha-san, began a training regimen so intense that it could be likened to an artist shaping clay into a masterpiece. Every hour of the day was structured, from learning traditional music to mastering the delicate steps of dance. The mako would be immersed in the world of arts from the very start, learning not just skills, but the subtle, non-verbal cues and the expectations of feminine behavior. It was a life of unrelenting work, every day devoted to refining their craft, their image, and their ability to perform for the upper echelons of Japanese society. The first and most physical manifestation of a mako's transformation is the kimono, a garment so emblematic of the geisha world that it is, inseparable from the identity of the woman wearing it. For the Mako, wearing the kimono is more than just dressing up, it's an art form in itself. At first, the apprentice struggles with its weight and complexity, as the kimono, with its thick silk fabric and heavy layers, can weigh several kilograms. The kimono is not merely worn. It is constructed upon the body, wrapping around the young girl's figure in a way that demands grace and balance in every step she takes. From the outer robe down to the intricate obi wrapped tightly around her waist, each component of the kimono has its own significance, not just in aesthetic terms but in societal hierarchy. The obi, a thick, sometimes cumbersome sash, is tied so tightly that it restricts the natural movement of the body. The Mako must walk in a way that does not show the burden of the kimono, but instead moves as if the layers of silk are a natural extension of her body. The weight of the fabric against the skin is a constant reminder of her duty to appear graceful at all times, and this delicate balance of restriction and freedom becomes an integral part of her training. The obligation to wear the kimono perfectly is almost a spiritual one, as it is not just a garment but a cultural symbol. The placement of the obi, the exact positioning of the sleeves, the tightness of the waist, and the symmetry of the folds are scrutinized in great detail. The Mako must learn not only to tie the kimono, but to do so with finesse, every fold and twist creating an impeccable visual representation of discipline. This is a life in which even the smallest imperfection, whether it is a slight wrinkle in the obi or an incorrect fold, can feel like a failure. And then there is the walk. Learning to move in the kimono is a practice of endless repetition, a slow dance with a restrictive fabric. It is not enough to simply walk. The apprentice must glide, moving with a soft swaying motion that maintains the perfect balance of composure. The clack of the geta becomes a rhythm that guides each step, like the ticking of a clock that marks the passing of time in her training. She must move with elegance, even as the kimono's weight drags her down, and her body tires from the sheer effort of keeping perfect balance. The swaying of the hips becomes a natural movement, where the kimono's fabric ripples and reflects. The rhythm of the Mako's step smooth, unbroken, and full of grace. The struggle for fluidity under the burden of such intricate clothing is both a physical test and a symbolic act of control over one's body. While the kimono defines the geisha's external appearance, the shamisen, the three-stringed instrument that has become synonymous with geisha, the heart of her musical artistry. The practice of playing the shamisen, though seemingly an elegant art, is also a test of precision and endurance. For the Mako, learning the shamisen means immersing herself in a world of sound, where each note is imbued with meaning and emotion. Picture the shamisen's distinctive tone, the soft, reverberating hum of its strings as they are plucked gently by the plectrum. The sound fills the practice room, soft at first, as the Mako learns the basic rhythms and melodies. In the beginning, each note is awkward and tentative. The Mako's fingers fumble over the strings, and her movements are stiff and unsure. The Mako must practice for hours each day to develop the dexterity needed to control the instrument, learning not just the technical skills but also how to express emotion through the music. Every strum of the plectrum must be controlled and deliberate, like a painter creating delicate strokes on canvas, each gesture telling a story. As the Mako's skills progress, the shamisen becomes more than an instrument. It becomes an extension of her soul, a way for her to communicate with her audience beyond words and gestures. The music is a dialogue between the performer and the listener, and through the subtle shifts in tone, the Mako can convey everything from longing to joy, from melancholy to triumph. The time spent in shamisen practice isn't just about learning to play a song. It's about learning to embody emotional depth, to project feelings into the strings, and to create a connection with her audience. Mastering the shamisen is an act of constant refinement. The music that flows from the instrument is never haphazard. It must always be controlled, purposeful, and in perfect harmony with the delicate dance movements that accompany it. Every note must resonate with meaning, pulling the listener into the geisha's performance, so much so that they are drawn into the emotional world she creates through her art. The geisha's mastery of the shamisen is not only a musical achievement but a reflection of her personal discipline. Just as with the kimono, the shamisen requires precise control and attention to detail. The hours of practice, the gentle plucking, the careful attention to the rhythm are not simply for entertainment. They are a sacred tradition, connecting the geisha to her cultural heritage, her audience, and, ultimately, to herself. In the world of the geisha, dance is not merely a performance, it's a spiritual practice, an expression of both discipline and artistry. The movements, often delicate and slow, are woven into the fabric of Japanese tradition, offering a glimpse into the inner life of the performer. The Mako, as the apprentice, Geisha is called, must master this art from a young age, dedicating years to learning the most subtle and precise movements. From the moment she enters the training world, a young girl, often no older than 6 or 7 years old, begins the long, arduous process of becoming one with the very traditions she must eventually embody. Every movement she makes must be a reflection of not only her training but the values of Japanese culture: grace, beauty, humility, and poise. Imagine yourself standing in a quiet practice room, a space where the light is soft and the air thick with the scent of incense. The only sounds you hear are the rustling of silk kimonos, the gentle tap of geta, and the soft strumming of the shamisen in the background. Here, each gesture, every shift in posture, is part of a larger, silent conversation, a dance between tradition and the inner world of the dancer. To the untrained eye, it might seem like simple movement, a set of steps, a series of hand gestures, a fluid transition from one position to another. But in reality, these movements are steeped in profound meaning and cultural significance. The geisha dance is designed to transmit emotion without the use of words, to express stories, thoughts, and sentiments purely through the body's subtle motions. The intricate gestures and steps have been honed over generations, representing not just technical prowess, but the embodiment of thematic ideas like longing, grace, balance, and impact. The Mako begins her dance training with the simplest of gestures, swaying her hips. At first glance, this movement might seem easy, perhaps even childishly simple, but there is an inherent complexity in the graceful sway of the body, a delicate rhythm that must be learned with precision. To the observer, the movement is effortless, but to the dancer, it requires an intense focus on balance and fluidity. The Mako's hips must sway gently, as though the very motion is a natural extension of the kimono she wears. The kimono, made of heavy silk and structured with multiple layers, adds an extra dimension of difficulty. The stiff obi wrapped tightly around the waist restricts natural movement, forcing the dancer to control her body and move as though the fabric is not a burden, but an extension of her own grace. The weight of the kimono reminds her that every motion, even the smallest, must be performed with an awareness of self-control and restraint. The Mako's movement is never abrupt. It must be gentle, flowing seamlessly from one step to the next. The swaying hips are only the beginning, and this movement requires the dancer to master the art of balance and posture. Her body must remain poised as if she is tethered to an invisible force, a balancing act between the heavy kimono and the delicate sway of her form. In many ways, the hip sway embodies the very essence of the geisha's life, the tension between beauty and constraint, between the freedom of expression and the discipline required to maintain poise. This simple movement is a metaphor for the life of a geisha, the art that demands perfection, but also the suppression of the self in the service of cultural expression. But the dance is more than just the hips. The arms, always fluid, always gentle, add another layer of complexity. The geisha's arms must move with a precision that matches the delicacy of the kimono's fold. The hand gestures, particularly those used in the dance, are not spontaneous. They are carefully cultivated to reflect not just the beauty of the body in motion, but the emotion behind the dance. The delicate raising of the arm, the soft opening of the hand, and the controlled flow of the fingers tell a silent story. Each gesture is deliberate, each movement crafted to represent both grace and strength. The arms, in their fluidity, connect the physical body of the geisha to the world of performance. When the Mako moves her arms, it is as though she is painting the air with her body, creating a silent narrative that is both personal and universal. As the Mako advances in her training, she becomes increasingly adept at adding emotion to these movements. A simple hand gesture can convey longing, joy, or sadness, all without a single word spoken. The geisha dance becomes an exercise in nonverbal communication, where every gesture, from the placement of the hands to the delicate curve of the arm, communicates an internal story that the audience can feel but not necessarily articulate. As the Mako dances, the sensory environment around her adds to the depth of the experience. The kimono rustles with every motion, the silk fabric brushing against itself as the geisha glides across the room. There is a soft rustling sound, like the whispers of a dream, that fills the air with a quiet elixir. The gentle sway of her hips is accompanied by the soft tapping of geta, traditional wooden santozugins, the polished wooden floors of the tea. The sound is faint, yet persistent, the rhythm of her footsteps, mirroring the slow pulse of the music. The room is filled with a soft smell of incense, which permeates the air with an almost ethereal presence. The incense is not overpowering, but it adds an element of calmness to the scene, grounding the Mako in the moment. The sweet woody scent seems to interact with the rhythm of the dance, creating an atmosphere that is both peaceful and sublime. The shamisen provides the musical backdrop, its strings plucked with gentle precision. The sound of the shamisen resonates through the room, filling the space with a deep, mournful tone that complements the movement of the dancer. Each note played is like a silent heartbeat, marking the passage of time as the geisha's body sways, each motion a symphony of silence. As the geisha dances, the senses become intertwined, the movement of the body, the sound of the shamisen, the fragrance of incense, and the rhythm of the footsteps all work in harmony, creating a moment of complete unity between the performer, the music, and the audience. The dance is a language in itself, a visual poetry that speaks without words, yet communicates everything that is needed. The art of geisha dance is steeped in symbolism. Every step, every gesture, carries deeper meanings drawn from Zen and Japanese aesthetics. The slow, deliberate movement of the body represents the concept of impermanence, the understanding that all beauty, like the fleeting moment of a swaying dance, is ephemeral. The geisha dance reflects the Japanese philosophy that all things in life are transitory, a central tenet of Zen Buddhism. In this way, the dance becomes not just a performance for entertainment, but a spiritual act. Each movement is a meditation, a way to connect with the present moment and convey a deeper understanding of the human condition. Through her body, the geisha expresses her mastery of not only the external arts, but also the internal journey to achieve a perfect balance between beauty, discipline. From the moment a young girl steps into the Oche house to begin her journey as a Mako, at a tender age often no older than 6 or 7 years, these girls embark on a path where their lives are governed by discipline, constant evaluation, and an unyielding pursuit of perfection. Every aspect of their training, whether it's learning the traditional dance, playing the shamisen, or mastering the art of conversation, demands immense mental focus and attention to detail. The pressure to perform at the highest level is not a temporary burden, but a weight that grows heavier with each day spent in apprenticeship. The first mental challenge is simply the sheer volume of learning that a Mako faces. Each day is filled with hours of practice, most of it repetitive, where she must refine even the most minute movements. The desire to please is paramount, and the constant scrutiny from superiors makes every misstep feel like a failure. This pressure is compounded by the unspoken expectation that each apprentice will absorb all these skills and arts without question or complaint. But it isn't just the physicality of the art that tests the Maiko's resilience. It's the mental stamina required to maintain composure and focus through it all. Imagine the emotional toll of being watched at every moment, of knowing that your actions will be judged not just by your superiors, but by the patrons whose opinions hold the power to elevate or diminish your status. The constant evaluation can breed a sense of self-doubt. But to express this is to fail the very first test, the art of self. A true geisha, even as an apprentice, must master the skill of appearing calm and composed, even when the mind is overwhelmed with exhaustion or anxiety. This is a high-stakes world, where the mind and body are constantly stretched, tested, and refined in the pursuit of artistic excellence, and the mental cost can be exhausting. The tension between self-expression and the demand to conform to social expectations is a silent battle that every Mako faces. The need to constantly perform and maintain a perfect image often creates inner turmoil. The emotional resilience required to stay focused and to mask any personal struggles or thoughts is taxing. Over time, the Mako learns to bury her individuality and suppress the natural human instinct to voice discomfort, frustration, or desire. At the heart of the geisha's training lies the emotional sacrifice of oneself. The geisha is taught from a young age to suppress her individuality, not only in her actions but also in her emotions. She must learn to project an image of perfect grace and humility, hiding any personal thoughts, desires, or feelings that might disrupt the illusion of elegance. For a Mako, this is a monumental emotional adjustment. Every action, every word, every gesture she makes is calculated to maintain the idealized image of the perfect entertainer. The emotional toll of this constant suppression is considerable. Imagine being required to smile, listen, and respond with grace, even when the heart is heavy, when personal thoughts or desires might be at odds with the image she is trying to project. The geisha's life becomes an act of perpetual self-control, where emotional expression becomes a form of performance. The ability to hide true feelings, to maintain composure despite inner turmoil, is a core skill that every geisha in training must develop. To reveal one's true emotions, whether joy, anger, frustration, or even sadnesses, to risk exposing a lack of control, which, in the world of the geisha, can be seen as a failure. The pressure to please patrons becomes an emotional responsibility that the mako carries with her wherever she goes. She must offer gentle conversation, perform elegantly, and maintain an air of mystery, all while suppressing any desire for personal connection. This dynamic creates a deep emotional void. The emotional labor required to maintain this perfect persona is not just mentally exhausting, but also emotionally depleting. Every evening spent entertaining and engaging with patrons leaves little room for personal emotional connection or genuine relationships. The apprentice must constantly maintain the delicate balance between professionalism and subordination. In a world where the geisha's value is tied to her ability to perform and entertain, she is expected to detach herself from her personal desires to be a vessel of tradition, her own needs and emotions locked away in favor of the greater cultural duties she must fulfill. Over time, this emotional restraint becomes so ingrained in the geisha's daily life that her true self might become obscured. The personal sacrifices involved in becoming a geisha mean that the inner world of the individual often becomes invisible, swallowed by the constant demands of performance. For the young girls who step into the world of the geisha, the sacrifices they make are profound and irreversible. Leaving home is the first of many personal losses. These girls, often from poor or middle-class families, must leave behind the only life they have ever known, moving into the tea house to begin their apprenticeship. Their new home, while offering them training and support, is also a place of regimented structure where their lives are dictated by schedules, practices, and performances. The geisha life means the loss of personal freedom. Many mako experience deep isolation. Their training requires that they live within the walls of the tea, their time governed by strict schedules that leave little room for relaxation or leisure. Social interactions outside of the tea house are rare, as every moment must be devoted to improving their craft. Friends and family are left behind, and relationships are often put on hold. The absence of family life in the early years can be especially painful, as the geisha's world becomes an insulated, self-contained sphere. The loss of personal relationships is compounded by the fact that the mako and geisha live under the scrutiny of their mentors and superiors. Their every move, gesture, and action are examined, with little room for personal autonomy or deviation from the established norms. A mako's identity becomes intertwined with the image she projects to the outside world, and that image is strictly curated, designed to meet the expectations of those around her. The sacrifices are not only emotional but also physical. The training is intense, and the demands placed on the mako's body can be overwhelming. Wearing the heavy kimono, learning to move in the geta, and practicing for hours on end in the shamisen or dance puts incredible strain on her body. Yet, despite the physical discomfort, the mako must never show signs of fatigue or weakness. Her body becomes a tool for performance, and any discomfort must be endured silently, without complaint. This constant physical sacrifice serves as a constant reminder that the geisha's life is one of service to her patrons, to her tradition, and to her mentor. The life of a geisha in training is marked by rigid control, constant self-restraint, and the emotional burden of suppressing one's true self. The sacrifices made living home, foregoing personal happiness, and giving up the ability to express emotions freely create an intense internal conflict. The desire for individual expression often clashes with the need for perfection and compliance. The emotional sacrifice is not just a byproduct of the geisha's training, but an integral part of the role itself. The ability to suppress one's desires, to sacrifice personal freedom, and to focus entirely on pleasing others is not just encouraged, it is expected. The geisha's life demands that she put others first, her art second, and her identity last. In doing so, the mako becomes part of something larger than herself, a tradition that has been passed down for generations. The journey from a mako to a fully fledged geisha is a transformation that takes not just time but immense discipline, dedication, and personal sacrifice. This transition is a significant event, not only marking the end of apprenticeship but also signaling the maturation of the young woman into a culturally revered artist. However, the path to becoming a geisha is neither easy nor guaranteed. Not every maker would make it to this revered status. Some would remain apprentices for years, and others would leave the profession for various personal or practical reasons. The transition is marked by several ceremonial and symbolic rituals. each representing the maturation of the young girl into a woman fully embedded in the geisha tradition. The geisha's world is one of strict hierarchy, and these rituals signify her ascent in that hierarchy, transforming her from a youthful apprentice into a full-fledged geisha, a woman whose beauty, skills, and artistic mastery are now deemed fully refined. To become a geisha was no small feat. A maiko would typically undergo years of intensive training in the traditional arts such as dance, shamisen, calligraphy, tea ceremonies, and social etiquette. But what marked her as an apprentice was the style of her kimono and the mannerisms of youth. The maiko's kimonos were often brightly colored with floral patterns or designs symbolizing nature, vibrant and youthful, representing the energy and vibrancy of young womanhood. Her attire, while still elegant, was less formal than that of the older geishas. The maiko would often wear her hair in elaborate styles, with decorative pins, flowers, and other accessories that further highlighted her youthfulness. This attire, combined with her energetic and often playful persona, distinguished her from the more mature and experienced geishas she would eventually become. The years spent as a maiko were both a time of learning and a testing ground for the young apprentice. To become a geisha, she had to prove herself worthy not only through skill and artistry, but also through her ability to represent the geisha world with dignity and self-discipline. The journey to this status was arduous, and patience was essential. Personal development, learning how to move with grace, speak with charm, and play the shamisen with technical mastery, was tested at each step. By the time a maiko became a geisha, she was expected to have achieved the highest standards in every aspect of the geisha arts. The transition from maiko to geisha is marked by several symbolic rituals, each representing a major milestone in the life of the apprentice. One of the most profound of these rituals is the cutting of the hair, which symbolizes the end of youth and the beginning of maturity. The first and most important ritual marking the transition to a fully fledged geisha is the cutting of the hair. This ritual signifies the end of youth and the embracing of a more mature, sophisticated image. The young maiko's hair is styled in complex patterns with ornate combs, pins, and decorative accessories, symbolizing her status as an apprentice. But when she is ready to transition into the role of a geisha, the style of her hair is dramatically altered. In this ritual, the maiko's hair is cut short, and she adopts a simpler style that is characteristic of a geisha, elegant, minimalist, and often tied back in a boot. This haircut represents the shedding of youth, but it is also a symbolic rebirth, as it marks her entrance into adulthood and the beginning of her formal career as a professional geisha. The cutting of the hair is accompanied by ceremonial rituals that are steeped in cultural significance, often involving the mentor or mother of the house, who oversees the transformation. This ritual is deeply symbolic, marking the moment when the young apprentice leaves behind the world of childhood and embraces the serious responsibilities of a mature geisha. In parallel with the cutting of the hair, another ritualistic shift takes place. The change in attire. The maiko's brightly colored kimonos, often made with vivid patterns of flowers, birds, or other symbols of nature, are gradually replaced with more sophisticated, understated attire. A geisha's kimono is characterized by its muted colors, usually in shades of dark blue, black, or white, and adorned with elegant but simple designs that reflect the maturity and refinement that comes with age. The geisha's attire signifies not only her formal status, but her role as an embodiment of the art's representation of refined elegance and cultural mastery. The change from the vibrant, youthful kimono to the more subdued colors of a geisha's attire represents the transformation of the apprentice into a woman whose presence is marked by quiet dignity and grace rather than exuberant youth. This change in attire also marks her increased status within the geisha hierarchy, as she now officially assumes the role of a fully fledged artist. She has matured, not only in her skills but in her ability to represent the ideals of beauty, grace, and tradition that define the geisha world. Once the haircut is completed and the mature attire has been donned, the young woman is now a geisha, professional artist. This final transition is celebrated with a formal ceremony where the new geisha is presented to the community. The event is an important milestone in the life of every geisha, as it signifies her official entry into the world of professional artistry. She is now ready to take on patrons, participate in tea ceremonies, perform in dance and music events, and showcase the cultural arts for which she has trained so diligently. The ceremony often involves the presentation of gifts, a show of respect from the other geishas and apprentices, and a reaffirmation of the geisha's duties to both her patrons and the community. It is during this time that she is formally introduced to society as a geisha, ready to carry on the legacy of the geisha tradition. She is no longer just an apprentice. She is now a woman with artistic freedom, cultural influence, and a well-respected place in the world of entertainment and Japanese aesthetics. The journey from Mako to geisha is not a guaranteed one. However, many young girls find that the demands of the geisha life are simply too great, and not all apprentices complete their training. Some may choose to leave the profession, or they may be asked to leave due to poor performance or failure to meet the high standards set by their mentors. The transition itself is so difficult that, even for those who succeed, it is often a hard-fought victory, one that requires personal sacrifice, patience, and emotional resilience. The path is long, and only those who are truly dedicated and possess the ability to perform at the highest level can succeed. This high level of competition among young Mako creates a sense of pressure, with only the most skilled and disciplined Mako achieving the title of geisha. In this world, failure is not just a personal disappointment, it is a cultural shortcoming, as the geisha tradition demands the best in both performance and decorum. The transition from Mako to geisha is a journey that encapsulates the essence of Japanese tradition, a process of maturation, refinement, and personal sacrifice. It marks the shift from youthful energy and exuberance to the subtle grace and wisdom that defines the geisha. Through symbolic rituals like the cutting of the hair and the change in attire, the becomes a geisha, stepping into a role that requires her to embody not just the arts but the values of an entire cultural heritage. In the next segment, we will turn our focus to Minako Iwasaki, one of the most famous geishas in Japanese history, whose personal story exemplifies the complexity of being a geisha in a world where both artistic excellence and personal sacrifice are demanded. Her life offers a glimpse into the often hidden struggles behind the facade of grace and beauty, as well as the powerful personal agency she fought to achieve within the confines of the geisha world. At the heart of the geisha tradition lies the mentorship system, a deeply ingrained practice that ensures the continued survival and transmission of the intricate skills, etiquette, and cultural wisdom essential to the life of a geisha. The relationship between a mentor and her mentee is not just about teaching the technical aspects of the craft, such as dance or tea ceremonies. It is about passing down the spiritual and social wisdom needed to thrive in the highly structured, demanding, and often mysterious world of the geisha. Mentors, usually older and more experienced geishas, play a central role in the formation of the Mako. These seasoned women serve as the guides and guardians of the cultural practices and traditions that define the profession. They not only teach the artistic skills required for a geisha's role, but also imbue their mentees with the knowledge and strategies necessary to navigate the nuances of social interactions, the etiquette of the geisha world, and the unwritten rules of their relationships with The mentor-mentee relationship within the geisha world is one of great significance, often beginning from the very moment a young girl enters the Ochiya house as a mentor. When a Mako first begins her training, she is assigned a mentor, a more experienced geisha, who will oversee her development and act as a guide through the complex social and artistic landscape of the geisha community. This relationship is akin to that of a mother and daughter, where the mentor, often referred to as the mother of the house, is responsible for nurturing and instructing her Mako on every aspect of the geisha life. The mentor is not just a teacher of skills but also of values. She imparts knowledge of the social expectations that govern their world, teaching her apprentice how to navigate the intricacies of conversation, respect, and self-presentation in the presence of the patrons they serve. A mentor's role goes beyond instruction. She serves as a model, an embodiment of grace, poise, and wisdom. The Mako watches her mentor closely, learning from her mannerisms, gestures, and comportment, all of which must remain impeccable at all times. Through this observation, the apprentice learns to not only perform the arts with proficiency, but also to live as a geisha, carrying with her the cultural weight of tradition, and serving as an ambassador of the geisha world. The mentor-mentee bond is one of mutual respect, with the mentor offering both practical guidance and emotional support throughout the difficult journey. The relationship is built on a deep trust. The mentor understands the personal sacrifices her apprentice must make, and the apprentice, in turn, places her trust in the wisdom and experience of her mentor. When a Mako first begins her training, much of her time is spent learning the technical skills of her craft. She practices the delicate footwork of the traditional dance, learns the intricate shamisen music, and perfects her knowledge of tea ceremonies. But, beyond these physical and artistic skills, the mentor's role is also to ensure that the Mako learns how to embody the geisha lifestyle in its entirety. The mentor teaches not only the steps, the melodies, and the etiquette of the tea ceremony, but also the unspoken rules of behavior, such as the subtle gestures of respect, the importance of humility, and the way to interact with patrons. The mentor guides the Mako through every aspect of social etiquette, including how to conduct herself in the presence of men, how to handle difficult conversations, and how to maintain a demeanor that reflects the geisha's inner grace. A mentor's responsibility extends to teaching the nuances of conversation. The art of conversation is one of the most important skills a geisha must learn. It involves more than simply talking. It is about how to listen, how to offer subtle responses, and how to maintain an air of mystique and refinement at all times. The geisha's conversations with patrons must be measured, polite, and never overbearing. There is an art to being charming, to knowing when to speak and when to be silent, and the mentor is the one who teaches this art through example. The mentor serves as both a trainer and a social guide, ensuring that the apprentice fully understands the formalities and customs that govern the geisha world. The young Mako might learn the basics of the shamisen and dance, but it is the mentor who helps her refine her abilities and understand their deeper meaning in the context of Japanese culture. It is through this careful guidance that the Mako begins to grow into the refined and complex woman who will one day take on the mantle of a full geisha. In the world of the geisha, social norms are just as important as the artistic skills. The mentor plays a crucial role in ensuring the Mako understands and navigates these social expectations. Beyond learning to play the shamisen and performing in traditional dances, the apprentice must learn the intricate etiquette of the geisha community and the wider world of the patrons. The Mako is taught the significance of humility, the art of polite conversation, and the unspoken social cues that accompany interactions between a geisha and her patrons. A mentor's responsibility here is to shape the Mako's social behavior, teaching her how to carry herself with grace and dignity. This requires not just mastery of artistic performance, but also an understanding of self-restraint, composure, and the subtle art of observation. For example, conversation with a patron is a delicate dance of giving, and the mentor teaches her apprentice how to balance being attentive with being reserved. The Mako must learn to keep her personal opinions to herself, always putting the needs and desires of the patron above her own. A geisha is never overtly emotional or expressive. Her charm lies in her subtlety and mystery, and it is through the mentor's guidance that the young girl learns to maintain an air of enigma. A mentor also guides the apprentice in understanding the cultural norms surrounding gender roles, hierarchy, and respect within the geisha community. For instance, a Mako must show proper deference to her seniors and patrons, understanding her place in the social hierarchy while striving to refine her craft. The mentor teaches the importance of discretion, how to maintain a calm, controlled demeanor even in the face of challenges or difficult situations. The mentor-mentee relationship is not only about teaching technical skills and cultural norms, it is also about providing emotional and psychological support. The geisha's life, while prestigious, can be emotionally taxing. The Mako must constantly suppress her own desires, mask her personal struggles, and live under the weight of high expectations. This can lead to moments of loneliness, exhaustion, and even suffering. A mentor plays a critical role in helping the Mako navigate these emotional challenges. She serves as a confidant, someone with the experience to guide the young apprentice through moments of doubt or confusion. The mentor understands the pressures of the profession and can offer advice, encouragement, and even comfort when needed. The mentor's wisdom is passed down not just through verbal instruction, but also through actions. As she provides a living example of how to maintain grace under pressure, she imparts the knowledge of how to balance the demanding geisha life with the inner strength required to endure it. Through the mentor's steady presence, the Mako learns that emotional resilience is just as important as artistic ability in the life of a geisha. The mentor-mentee relationship in the world of the geisha is essential to the survival of this ancient tradition. It is through the guidance of these older, wiser geishas that the young apprentices learn not just the art of performance, but the wisdom required to navigate the complex social landscape they must inhabit. The bond between mentor and mentee is not just one of instruction, it is one of nurturing, guiding, and supporting. Minako Iwasaki's life began in 1949. In the heart of the Gion district of Kyoto, Japan, an era steeped in the tradition of geisha culture. From a young age, Minako was destined to enter the world of the ocha houses, where the geishas and Mako performed for patrons, embodying the elegance, artistry, and sophistication of Japanese culture. Her family, though not wealthy, had deep connections to the geisha community, and this connection would shape the course of her life. Minako was only 4 years old when she entered the world of the geisha apprenticeship, joining the Oche house that would become her new home. In the Gion district, the streets were lined with narrow alleys leading to elegant tea houses where traditional art, music, and conversation were the heart of entertainment for the elite of Japanese society. The Gion district in Kyoto, known for its historic significance, was the epicenter of the geisha world, a place where patrons, celebrities, and politicians came to experience the finest traditional performances. At the time, the role of a mako was an honor, but it also came with immense pressure. For young girls like Minako, the decision to become a mako was often not theirs to make, but rather a path set by familial tradition. The decision to join an OCA house at such a young age was a cultural norm that ensured the continuation of a legacy, but also demanded self-discipline and sacrifice. As the youngest daughter of a modest family, Minako's entrance into the geisha world was seen as a way to secure her future, offering the potential of prestige and financial stability. However, this path, steeped in tradition, came with expectations that were far more demanding than simply learning artistic performance. The geisha life required young girls to give up childhood freedom in exchange for a life of rigorous training, strict obedience, and the continual pressure of perfecting the art of being an entertainer. A young mako's world was one of structure, where every action, every word, and every gesture was monitored, refined, and improved upon to meet the standards of the geisha community. When Minako entered the Ocha house as an apprentice, she was thrust into a world where her life would no longer be her own. The geisha apprenticeship was not just about becoming proficient in the arts of dance, music, and conversation. It was about learning to embody the essence of what it meant to be a geisha. The training was rigorous, and the stakes were high. A mako's every movement had to reflect not only technical proficiency, but also an innate sense of beauty and grace. Minako's early days were filled with intense practice and discipline. Her days began early and were marked by hours of learning to play the shamisen, a traditional Japanese string instrument that required meticulous finger placement, precision, and the sound of the shamisen was not only musical but symbolic, representing the very rhythm of a geisha's life, steady, controlled, and beautiful. For Minako, this meant repetition and endurance, mastering a craft that would ultimately define her career. But the shamisen was only one part of the geisha arts. A mako must also master traditional dance, which required grace and control in every movement. The dance was not just about technique. It was a form of expression, a way to convey emotions, thoughts, and stories through elegant gestures and subtle movements. The mako's body became a vessel for cultural expression, and her ability to dance well marked her status as an accomplished apprentice. The tea ceremony, another cornerstone of geisha training, was equally demanding. Minako had to learn the delicate art of serving tea in a way that was both aesthetic and ritualistic. The art of tea service wasn't just about making tea, it was about conveying the Zen-like principles of calmness, balance, and refinement. Every gesture, from the way the tea bowl was presented to the timing of each action, had to be precise and graceful, reflecting the geisha's inner poise. In addition to these physical and technical skills, Minako's training also emphasized the nuances of conversation. The art of conversation was a vital skill for any geisha, requiring not just the ability to speak, but the wisdom to know when to remain silent, how to listen attentively, and how to provide thoughtful responses that would engage her patrons. Every word, every laugh, every comment was scrutinized for its appropriateness, with the geisha expected to maintain an air of mystery and composure at all times. Patrons came to the geisha houses not only for entertainment but also for companionship, a kind of intellectual and emotional engagement that was as refined and subtle as the geisha's physical performance. This all-encompassing training required Minako to relinquish any sense of personal freedom. Her time was no longer her own, and her days were carefully divided between practice and service. The pressure was immense both from within the geisha house and from the wider geisha community to be the best, to embody the ideals of grace and sophistication at all times. For a young girl like Minako, this meant sacrificing not just her time, but a sense of selfhood. She was constantly measured against her mentors and the other mako, who also sought to prove their worth. Challenges faced during early years, emotional distance and personal sacrifices. Minako's journey as a Mako was not just one of physical training, but emotional and psychological transformation. She was expected to suppress any sense of personal desire or emotion in favor of becoming an idealized version of the geisha. As a Mako, her personal identity became secondary to her role as an entertainer, a cultural vessel whose primary function was to serve her patrons and the geisha house. The emotional distance from her family was one of the greatest sacrifices she made in her early years. The Mako's life required total immersion in the world of the geisha, and this meant that personal relationships were often left behind. Minako was separated from her family for long periods, and though she may have longed for their companionship, she had to remain focused on her training and obligations. The sense of loss was inevitable, as the geisha house became her new home, and her mentor, the mother, became her primary caregiver and guide. While the geisha world offered prestige and the allure of cultural refinement, it also demanded a deep sacrifice of self. For a young girl like me, this meant foregoing normal childhood experiences, the simple joys of playing with friends, spending time with family, or exploring personal ambitions. The world of the Mako was one of strict rules, where every action was meticulously controlled, and personal freedom was a distant dream. Despite these challenges, Minako demonstrated exceptional determination and talent, excelling in every aspect of her training. The emotional toll, however, remained ever present. As a young apprentice, she found herself caught between the expectations of the geisha world and her own desires for something more than what the system offered. Even as she mastered the skills required of her, she began to recognize the limits of the role imposed on her. Feeling the struggle between obedience and individuality growing stronger with each passing year, Minako Iwasaki's early days as a Miko were marked by a conflict of identities that clash between the disciplined world of the geisha and her own personal aspirations. The journey to become a geisha was not only one of technical mastery but also emotional sacrifice. The Mako was expected to give herself fully to the art of entertainment, and in doing so, she would inevitably distance herself from the life she had once known. As Minako Iwasaki advanced through the ranks of the Mako world, it quickly became clear that her talents extended far beyond the standard training. Unlike many young girls who entered the ocha houses and dedicated themselves to mastering the geisha arts, Minako displayed an innate skill that set her apart as one of the most promising apprentices in the Gion district, the epicenter of geisha culture in Kyoto. Her ability to play the shamisen, the three-string traditional Japanese instrument, was exceptional. The shamisen is at the heart of the geisha arts, accompanying traditional dances, and Minako's mastery of this instrument allowed her to express not just technical proficiency, but also the subtle emotions inherent in each performance. Her fingers seemed to move effortlessly across the strings, and each strum and pluck resonated with a deep sense of poise and sensitivity. Unlike many Mako who struggled with the technical aspects of the shamisen, in addition to her proficiency with the shamisen, Minako excelled in the traditional dance that is an integral part of geisha performance. Dance for a Mako was not just a display of grace and elegance, it was a deeply symbolic practice, one that conveyed stories, emotions, and the beauty of Japanese culture. Minako's performances were meticulously choreographed, yet she had the rare ability to bring an element of fluidity and emotion to her movements, making each step and gesture seem like a form of art in motion. She had the rare gift of timing, knowing exactly when to pause, hold a position, and transition with subtlety and precision. What truly set Minako apart, however, was her ability to connect with patrons through conversation, an art form that many geishas struggled with, as it required not only verbal dexterity but also a certain emotional intelligence. A geisha's conversation is designed to be elegant, engaging, and mysterious, something that invites a sense of closeness without revealing too much. Minako's ability to listen, offer just the right amount of insight, and leave enough mystique in her words made her particularly sought after. She possessed a rare ability to make a patron feel truly seen, without revealing anything personal about herself, an art that few in the geisha world truly mastered. Her beauty, while undeniable, was only one facet of what made her so successful. It was her combination of grace, emotional intelligence, artistic skill, and subtle charm that made her one of the most coveted geishas in the Gion district. As she honed her craft, she was increasingly sought after by elite patrons, celebrities, and business tycoons, all of whom were drawn to her for not only her beauty but her ability to provide an experience that felt personal and authentic, a rare gift in a world of performers and artificiality. Despite her rapid success and fame, Minako's rise to prominence in the geisha world was not without personal struggles. As she moved further into the ranks of the geishas, her fame grew, but so did the pressure to maintain a perfect image. While she was celebrated for her artistic prowess, Minako began to face the profound emotional toll that came with constantly suppressing her individuality and maintaining the mystique demanded by the geisha lifestyle. The geisha world was built on a foundation of eternal grace and unquestioning obedience. A geisha, and especially a mako, was not meant to express her desires openly. She was a reflection of the cultural ideals of femininity and self-restraint, not a woman with a fully realized self. As Minako's reputation and fame grew, so too did the expectations placed upon her to remain silent, mysterious, and unavailable, to be a vessel of traditional art and beauty, rather than a person with personal needs and wants. This emotional suppression began to take its toll. Minako, who had always been a highly self-aware and emotionally intelligent individual, found herself becoming increasingly conflicted about the life she had committed to. While she could perform the role of the perfect geisha to perfection, she felt distant from the woman she truly was. Minako's art was an expression of elegance, but her soul longed for a kind of freedom that was increasingly out of reach. She wanted to be authentic, to express herself not just through her art, but in her everyday life. However, the geisha system demanded a life of constant performance, where even the most personal moments were governed by the need to maintain a perfect geisha persona. This internal conflict between who she was expected to be and who she truly was became an ever-present source of emotional tension, making Minako increasingly disillusioned with the system she had once embraced. As Minako reached the peak of her success as a mako, she faced the inevitable transition into becoming a full geisha. This was not only a professional milestone, but also a personal transformation that carried with it both ceremonial significance and emotional weight. The transition from mako to geisha was marked by several symbolic rituals that represented her growth into a more matured woman within the world of geishas. The most important of these rituals was the cutting of her hair. The mako's hair was typically styled in elaborate updos, adorned with decorative pins, flowers, and jewels, all indicative of youth and vitality. The geisha's hair, by contrast, was styled much more simply and was typically tied in a bun, symbolizing the mature elegance of a fully established geisha. The cutting of the hair was both a physical and symbolic act, marking the point when a young girl shed her identity as an apprentice and fully entered the world of a professional geisha. In tandem with this haircut, Minako was also required to change her kimono. As a mako, her kimonos were brightly colored and elaborately patterned, signaling her youthful status. Once she became a geisha, her attire became much simpler and more understated. Geisha kimonos were typically made of darker, more muted colors such as black, blue, and white, symbolizing maturity, refinement. The transition from bright to subtle in terms of color reflected a shift in Minako's role from an energetic, youthful apprentice to a seasoned artist who embodied the grace and mystique that the geisha world revealed. This transition was not just a physical change, however, it was also an emotional and psychological one. Becoming a full geisha signified not just maturation, but also an increased sense of responsibility. A geisha was no longer just a performer. She was expected to uphold the legacy of the geisha tradition and maintain the high standards that the world of Japanese art demanded. Minako, now a full geisha, would be expected to entertain the higher society and navigate the increasingly complex relationships with her patrons and peers. But the transition was bittersweet for Minako. It marked her entry into a new chapter, one that brought greater recognition and prestige, but it also required her to deepen her commitment to a system that, in many ways, demanded more than she was willing to give. The rituals surrounding her transition into full geisha status were beautiful, but they also marked the start of a new phase in her life, one that demanded even more of her emotional labor and less of her individual self. Becoming a full geisha was a momentous occasion for Min, one that brought her respect, status, and increased opportunities within the geisha world. But as the rituals of her transition were completed, the emotional and psychological struggles she had been quietly wrestling with began to deepen. The path ahead, while filled with prestige, also marked the continuation of a journey of internal conflict between artistic mastery and personal freedom. As Minako navigated this new chapter of her life as a full geisha, she began to realize that while the geisha world could offer her fame and recognition, It also required self-sacrifice, a level of commitment to the tradition that ultimately limited her sense of personal identity. This struggle between the roles of public entertainer and private individual would shape the rest of Minako's journey, leading her toward the eventual decision to leave the geisha world and seek a life of independence. As Minako Iwasaki's talents in the geisha arts began to attract attention, her rise to fame went beyond the boundaries of the Gion district, transcending the traditional realm of the geisha world and capturing the interest of the wider public. Initially, Minako's recognition was grounded in her mastery of the shamisen, her traditional dance, and her ability to engage with patrons in ways that were both subtle and engaging. As she grew more skilled, her reputation began to spread beyond the geisha community, eventually earning her the admiration of public figures and even celebrities. Minako's name was soon synonymous with geisha artistry, not just in Kyoto, but in high society across Japan. She became a symbol of grace, a living representation of traditional beauty that was rare even among the most talented geishas. Her refinement, elegance, and artistic talents placed her in high demand, making her a figure that was not only adored but revered. Her fame reached a point where her presence at a gathering was considered a mark of prestige. For those fortunate enough to have the honor of hosting her, having Minako as their guest was a statement in itself, a demonstration of their cultural sophistication and elite status. However, as her celebrity grew, so did the pressures that accompanied it. Geishas, by nature, were supposed to be mysterious figures, icons of subtlety and refinement, whose private lives were shielded from the public eye. Minako, however, found that her growing fame meant that the mystique central to the geisha identity was gradually fading. What was once a sacred art form where the geisha allure lay in her elusiveness now had to accommodate the unrelenting gaze of the media. The publicity that came with her growing fame had profound consequences on her sense of self. As she moved from the world of the geisha house to the spotlight of public attention, her private life became public property. Every performance, every photograph, and even her everyday movements became a subject of intense scrutiny. This intense media focus created a constant battle between the image she projected as a geisha and the individual that she was, resulting in a tension that would ultimately challenge her place in the geisha world. The mystique of a geisha, her elusive presence, her quiet charm, her ability to captivate without revealing too much of herself is central to the artistic tradition of geisha. This mystique is what makes a geisha not just an entertainer, but an embodiment of Japanese elegance and cultural beauty. However, as Minako's fame blossomed, she found herself caught in a paradox. The very qualities that made her famous were in direct conflict with the geisha's role as a mysterious figure. The geisha lifestyle, which traditionally placed emphasis on grace and anonymity, began to feel stifling for Min. As a public figure, she was expected to maintain a constant persona, one that fit into the highly structured world of the geisha tradition, yet was also subject to public demands for authenticity. The more famous she became, the more she had to perform not only in front of patrons, but in every public interaction. Every gesture, every conversation, and even her silence was under scrutiny. Minako was not just performing in a traditional sense, she was also forced to perform her identity as a geisha in a world that no longer left room for personal expression. This relentless need to maintain an idealized image came at a high cost. The pressure to remain graceful, composed, and mysterious even outside the geisha house eroded Minako's ability to be authentic. She became increasingly aware that the geisha persona she had worked so hard to perfect was not entirely her own. It was a role, a carefully curated performance that left little room for personal vulnerability or expression. The woman behind the mask was lost, buried beneath the expectations of what a geisha was supposed to be. For Minako, the internal conflict between her private self and the geisha persona she had to maintain grew more intense over time. As she became a celebrity, she had to constantly manage not only her emotions, but also her image. The geisha lifestyle, once a means of artistic and personal expression, became a performance in itself, where every move, every word, and every gesture was scrutinized for its grace and mystique. This performance became emotionally draining. The public's expectations of Minako, always be elegant, charming, and untouchable, began to erode her sense of individuality. She could no longer show her true emotions, for fear that doing so would break the illusion of the geisha mystique. As a geisha, Minako was expected to be the epitome of grace, to never express weakness or vulnerability. The mystique of the geisha required her to suppress her own emotions in favor of maintaining a public image of composure and control. As Minako's fame grew, she found that privacy was no longer an option. Public interest in her private life escalated, and the media's obsession with her every move forced her into a constant performance, one that began to feel more like a trap than an artistic vocation. Anonymity, which had once been an integral part of the geisha lifestyle, became a distant memory. Minako realized that she was no longer able to live as a person, but was instead a character created by the media, her personal identity subsumed by the public's insatiable demand for more. The mystique that defined the geisha lifestyle was a delicate balance between art, mystery, and silence. However, as Minako's fame grew, this mystique began to crumble. The media and public fascination with her life created an impossible situation for her as a geisha. How could she maintain the elusive charm that made her so captivating, when every aspect of her life was now in the public eye? The more publicity she garnered, the more the mystique that defined her geisha identity was dying. The mystique of a geisha was not just about performing for an audience, it was about leaving the audience wanting more, about remaining a mysterious figure whose true self was always just beyond reach. As Minako's fame grew, this mystique was replaced with accessibility. The media wanted to know more, to dig deeper into the life of the geisha. The desire for public access to her personal life began to overshadow the very qualities that had made her such an icon. Minako was no longer able to control the narrative of her own life, as it was constantly being rewritten by journalists, photographers, and the media at large. The erosion of the mystique was a powerful force in Minako's life. The geisha world was founded on the idea that the geisha was untouchable, a living work of art that belonged to the world but also stood apart from it. As the public's curiosity about Minako's life grew, she was increasingly forced to reveal parts of herself that the geisha tradition demanded remain hidden. She could no longer maintain the mystery that made her a geisha. Instead, she became a public figure, a celebrity whose life was for consumption, not just admiration. The fame Minako Iwasaki attained was both a blessing and a curse. While it provided her with prestige, recognition, and the ability to showcase her geisha artistry to the world, it also subjected her to constant scrutiny, eroding the mystique that was essential to her identity as a geisha. The pressures of maintaining a public persona and the loss of privacy took a significant emotional toll, leading Minako to question the very role she had embraced for so many years. As Minako Iwasaki's prominence within the geisha world grew, so did the weight of expectations placed upon her. From her early years as a mako to her rise as one of the most celebrated geishas in Japan, Minako had been molded by a world of discipline, service, and restraint. The geisha system, which had initially offered her the opportunity to showcase her exceptional artistic talents, gradually became a cage. As she gained recognition, the world around her demanded more than just her art. It began to demand her identity. Geishas are living works of art, expected to embody traditional elegance, mystery, and grace without ever revealing the person behind the mask. The geisha persona is a carefully constructed image that is cultivated over years of training and performance, and it is controlled by others, by the geisha house, by the patrons, and by the societal expectations that define the role. As Minako's fame reached new heights, the geisha persona she had created was no longer her own. It was shaped by external forces that dictated how she should behave, how she should look, and how she should engage with the world. For Minako, the desire for personal freedom began to clash with the rigid expectations of her geisha role. Initially, the geisha world had provided her with an outlet for her artistry, a way to express herself through the shamisen dance and conversation. However, as her fame grew, the need to constantly perform, to be always graceful, always elegant, and always mysterious became a burden. The emotional toll of suppressing her individuality to fit into this image grew more pronounced. The life of a geisha required constant self-restraint, which made it increasingly difficult for Minako to express her true desires and emotions. She was expected to be the embodiment of art, but in doing so, she felt as though she had lost touch with her authentic self. The geisha persona demanded that she constantly suppress her personal needs, from basic desires like privacy and independence to deeper yearnings for authenticity and self. The internal conflict between who she was expected to be and who she wanted to be created a growing sense of dissatisfaction and alienation. The desire for personal freedom became more urgent as Minako's life became increasingly dominated by external pressures. The geisha world, which had once been a source of pride, now felt like a prison, one where her individuality was stifled, and where she had to constantly perform a role that no longer felt aligned with her true identity. As she faced this growing tension, the realization dawned that, despite the prestige, and fame she had achieved, she could not continue living in a world that demanded her identity be subsumed by the geisha persona. The geisha system is founded on a deeply hierarchical structure, one that demands obedience and service to both patrons and the geisha house. Geishas are expected to live lives of selflessness, where every action is measured against the ideals of grace and perfection. These expectations are not just societal, they are embedded in the geisha tradition, which insists that a geisha must serve others, often at the expense of her own happiness. For Minako, the relationship with the geisha system became one of constant valuation, a system where every aspect of her life was scrutinized, from her performance to her behavior in social settings. As her fame grew, the pressure to maintain her public image, and she was no longer just a geisha, she had become a public figure, and the demands on her to embody the ideal geisha persona became even more suffocating. The geisha system may have provided Minako with prestige and financial stability, but it also demanded complete dedication, a dedication that required her to constantly suppress her personal desires. The geisha's role was not just about performing for patrons, but also about fulfilling a larger societal function. Geishas were seen as symbols of beauty, refinement, and mystique, representing the idealized version of Japanese femininity. However, this idealized image was rooted in a set of expectations that required sacrifice. In order to maintain this image, a geisha had to subjugate herself to the needs of the geisha house and her patrons before her own needs. This subjugation to the geisha system was not just professional but deeply psychological. Minako, like all geishas, was expected to be unfailingly polite, humble, and available for patrons, often at the expense of her personal time and relationships. The emotional cost of this selflessness became apparent as Minako struggled with the demands of constantly being a performer and servant. The geisha system offered her fame and respect, but it also required her to suppress her desires, often leading to a deep sense of loss. Minako was expected to be an idealized woman, but that meant she could never truly express herself. Her emotions had to be controlled and suppressed. The pressure of this emotional sacrifice weighed heavily on her, and as her fame grew, so did her awareness of the cost of maintaining this image. She could no longer reconcile the geisha persona with her own personal truth, and the emotional strain of living a life that was dictated by external expectations began to take a toll on her mental health and sense of self-worth. As Minako's career as a geisha progressed, the emotional toll of maintaining both her public persona and her private self became increasingly apparent. The geisha's role requires the sacrifice of personal happiness in favor of upholding a perfect image, one that is crafted by external expectations and traditional ideals. For Min, the conflict between these two realms of her public persona as a geisha and her private desires as a woman became a source of deep frustration and emotional pain. Geishas are not supposed to show weakness or reveal personal struggles. They are symbols of beauty, mystery, and grace, and their emotions are expected to remain hidden. Minako, however, began to feel the strain of constantly wearing this mask of perfection. The emotional cost of performing a role that was not entirely her own began to erode her sense of self. The geisha world demanded that she put aside her individuality, that she live for the art, the performance, and the public eye, but at what cost? Her emotional sacrifices were not just about giving up personal time, but about the loss of self-identity. As a geisha, Minako was constantly performing not just for her patrons, but for society at large. Her geisha persona was an idealized version of a woman, and it was one that could never be fully human. The burden of always being on display, always needing to maintain composure and mystique, left Minako feeling increasingly isolated from her true self. The internal conflict between who Minako was and who Minako had to be became unbearable. The geisha system had provided her with prestige and recognition, but it had also taken away her freedom, her ability to live on her own terms, to express herself fully, and to be seen as more than just a geisha. Over time, Minako began to feel that personal freedom was a price too high to pay for fame and prestige. Minako Iwasaki's struggle with autonomy and control was at the heart of her emotional conflict in the geisha world. While she achieved great fame and prestige, she began to realize that this came at the cost of her personal freedom. The geisha system, though offering external success, demanded that she sacrifice her individuality and emotional well-being. The pressure of maintaining the perfect geisha persona became overwhelming, and Minako felt increasingly trapped by the external expectations placed on her. In 1975, after nearly 2 decades of prestige, fame, and recognition, Minako Iwasaki made the deeply personal and bold decision to leave the geisha world. This marked an extraordinary shift in her life, our decision to break free from the very system that had both shaped her into one of the most celebrated and sought-after geishas in Kyoto and placed immense emotional and psychological strain upon her. Minako's departure was not a casual decision, nor one made in haste. It was the culmination of years of growing dissatisfaction with the geisha lifestyle. By 1975, Minako had achieved everything that the geisha world promised: recognition and a flourishing career. She had mastered the essential arts of the shamisen dance and tea ceremony, and was seen by many as a symbol of grace and elegance. But despite the external rewards, Minako began to feel an increasingly palpable disconnect between the public persona that she had cultivated. This dissonance between the geisha persona, which required constant performance and desire to live authentically, led to an internal conflict that she could no longer ignore. The geisha world, with its beautiful facade of artistic mastery, mystique, and tradition, demanded immense personal sacrifice. It placed unrelenting pressure on Minako to always maintain her composure, grace, and mystique even in the face of intense personal strain. What started as an artistic pursuit of beauty and elegance had gradually turned into a prison of expectations, where her identity and individuality were increasingly obscured by the roles she was expected to play. Her decision to leave was an act of defiance against a system that had once been her path to success, but had come to stifle her personal freedom. For Minako, the life she had worked so hard to build had become an unbearable weight. The more she was lauded for her skills and fame, the more she felt like she was losing herself. Her desire to break free from the constraints of the geisha world, where she was seen as an object of entertainment rather than a whole person, became more urgent. In essence, this departure marked a rejection of the role she had been forced to play, a role dictated by a set of traditions and societal expectations that stifled her personal expression. Leaving the geisha world was far from a simple decision. It was a monumental choice that forced Minako to confront the loss of status, prestige, and the life that defined her for decades. As one of the most recognized and beloved geishas in Kyoto, leaving the geisha system was akin to abandoning everything that had defined her personal and professional life. She was walking away from not only the material rewards, the wealth, adulation, and security, but also the social recognition and the sense of identity that being a geisha afforded her. The emotional impact of leaving the geisha world went beyond just losing fame. It was an emotional rupture that left Minako to deal with the sense of loss of status and belonging. The geisha system had offered her a sense of purpose, a sense of being part of something greater than herself, something steeped in tradition and honor. To leave meant cutting ties with a community that had been her family, her safety net, for much of her life. Minako's decision to leave the geisha world was not just about leaving a profession, but about abandoning a lifetime of relationships, including her mentor and her peers, who had played crucial roles in shaping her career. The geisha house she had been a part of had become a family to her, and severing those ties must have been emotionally difficult. Her mentor, who had nurtured her through her apprenticeship and had seen her rise to greatness, likely experienced a deep sense of disappointment and loss. The mentor-mentee relationship in the geisha world was sacred, and Minako's departure could easily have been viewed as a betrayal of the very tradition her mentor had worked so hard to pass down. The geisha system valued loyalty and dedication to both one's mentor and the broader geisha community. To walk away from that system could have been seen as a rejection of those values, a decision that would have likely strained her relationship with her mentor and with other geishas who remained in the profession. On the other hand, Minako's decision to leave could also have been seen by some as a trailblazing act of asserting personal autonomy in a world that demanded the suppression of individual desires. Her peers might have respected her for taking control of her own narrative, for having the strength to choose her freedom over prestige. But for many, especially those who adhered strongly to tradition, Minako's departure would have been perceived as a radical move, one that was incompatible with the values of loyalty and duty that had been central to the geisha lifestyle for centuries. Minako's decision was an emotionally complex one, as she had to balance the sacrifice of leaving behind a community and tradition she had spent so many years becoming a part of with the liberation she felt in stepping into a world where she could finally live for herself. Minako's journey after leaving the geisha world was not one of retreat but of reinvention. She faced the challenge of starting over, of finding herself outside of the role that had been imposed upon her for so long. While she had gained fame, prestige, and recognition in the geisha world, she had also paid the price of suppressing her own individuality, living in a cultural cage defined by tradition and social expectations. Now, With the world of geishas behind her, Minako was tasked with carving out a new path, one where she could finally live authentically. One of the most pivotal steps in her reinvention was the publication of her memoir Geisha, A Life. The memoir served as an outlet for Minako's voice, one that had been silenced for much of her life in the geisha system. Through her writing, Minako not only reclaimed her own story but also exposed the hidden truths of the geisha world, its emotional tolls, sacrifices, and personal costs. The memoir allowed her to share the pain of living under the constant weight of expectations, to reveal the challenges she had faced in a profession that demanded perfection at the expense of personal freedom. By publishing her story, Minako was asserting her individuality, rejecting the idea of being just a symbol of cultural tradition and instead embracing the power of self. Writing the memoir was not just about revealing the truth of the geisha world, but also about finding her own voice in a world that had long tried to silence it. She had spent years living as a silent performer, and now she was able to speak her truth freely and authentically for the first time in her life. Minako's memoir also marked a significant moment in her self-empowerment. By telling her story, she took control of her legacy, no longer defined solely by the geisha world, but also by the freedom she had found by stepping outside of it. Her decision to speak out and expose the realities of geisha life was a radical act of personal liberation and a rejection of the system that had once defined her. She became more than just a geisha. She became a voice for women who had been silenced and marginalized by tradition. Minako Iwasaki's decision to leave the geisha world in 1975 marked the culmination of years of internal struggle between the prestige of a successful career and the cost of suppressing her authentic self. Her decision to step away from everything she had worked for was a bold rejection of external expectations, a refusal to continue living in a system that demanded her self-sacrifice in exchange for fame and recognition. By leaving the geisha world, Minako began a journey towards where she could finally live for herself and speak her truth without the constraints of tradition or societal judgment. Her memoir, Geisha, A Life, became an essential part of that journey, an act of self-expression and empowerment that allowed Minako to reclaim her voice and her identity. In telling her story, she not only exposed the hidden realities of the geisha world, but also showed that the freedom to live authentically and express her true self was worth more than any prestige or honor that the geisha system could offer. Minako's legacy is not just that of a celebrated geisha, but also that of a woman who chose to assert her autonomy, to reclaim her life, and to live on her own terms. Her decision to leave the geisha world was a pivotal moment in her personal journey, a journey of self-liberation, authenticity, and the power of finding one's own voice in a world that often demands silence. Minako Iwasaki's life and her decision to leave the geisha world represent a pivotal moment in the evolution of the geisha profession, challenging the long-held romanticized image of geishas as mere symbols of beauty and grace. The geisha lifestyle has been portrayed in popular culture as a world of mystique and elegance, where women live in dedicated service to their art, their patrons, and their traditions. The geisha is often seen as an exotic, almost sacred figure, one whose entire being is centered on the aesthetic beauty of traditional Japanese culture. However, Minako's life and her courageous decision to leave the geisha world in 1975 provide a more nuanced, more complex narrative that challenges this idealized perception. By sharing her story through her memoir, Geisha, A Life, Minako became a cultural icon who transcended the role of the geisha as an entertainer, an artist. Her legacy is not just rooted in her mastery of the art sutra shamisen dance and tea ceremonies, but in her ability to articulate the emotional toll and psychological sacrifices required to maintain the public image of a geisha. Through her own words, Minako revealed the human cost of living in a world where one's identity is constantly shaped by external expectations, and where personal desires are subordinated to the demands of the profession. Minako's life and her decision to leave have reframed the geisha narrative. Instead of simply romanticizing the geisha as an unblemished symbol of tradition, she has forced a re-examination of what it truly means to live as a geisha, not just the allure and prestige, but also the emotional labor, the sacrifices, and the inner conflict that accompany the role. Her story challenges the idealized image of the geisha world and exposes the complicated and often painful realities that many geishas have faced, but have rarely been able to articulate due to societal expectations of silence and compliance. Minako's decision to leave the geisha world was not just a personal act of defiance. It also had profound implications for future generations of geisha. For centuries, The geisha profession had been governed by a rigid set of traditions that emphasized discipline and obedience. Geishas were expected to live their lives in service to their patrons, adhering to a code of etiquette and grace, while maintaining an aura of mystery and secrecy. Personal autonomy was a luxury many geishas could not afford. Their lives were consumed by the geisha tradition, and their individual desires were often disregarded or suppressed in favor of preserving the prestige of the profession. Minako's exit from the geisha world shattered the long-standing notion that the role of a geisha was a passive existence, defined solely by traditional expectations. Her decision to step away from the rigid boundaries of the geisha system has been an inspiration for future generations of geishas who seek to express themselves as individuals within the constraints of the tradition. Through Minako's story, younger geishas began to see that it was possible to honor the arts and traditions of the geisha world while also pursuing a life of personal autonomy. Authenticity. Minako's memoir has become a catalyst for discussion within the geisha community, encouraging more personal expression and self-empowerment. Though the geisha world remains rooted in tradition, there has been a shift toward allowing for more personal freedom within the role, especially among younger generations of geisha. In her writings, Minako provided a revelatory look at the emotional and psychological costs of the profession, which in turn gave voice to many other geishas who had never before dared to speak out. Minako's legacy, in this sense, has paved the way for greater, allowing geishas today to embrace their artistic mastery without entirely suppressing their personal voices. Minako Iwasaki's life is not just one of fame and success, it is also a story of sacrifice, personal struggle, and the pursuit of authenticity. Her journey is a profound reflection of the human desire to assert one's individuality, while also honoring the tradition that one has been born into. The geisha world, with its rigid expectations and rigid structures, forced Minako to sacrifice not just her personal desires, but her very sense of self. Yet, in choosing to leave that world, Minako proved that it is possible to honor tradition while also asserting one's autonomy. Her decision to walk away from a world that had given her prestige, but also required her to suppress her individuality, marked the beginning of her journey to self. The memoir she wrote after leaving the geisha world was an act of both self-liberation and a way of reclaiming her voice and asserting her agency. Through her writing, she not only exposed the hidden sacrifices and emotional tolls of the geisha world, but also gave future generations the courage to live authentically, while maintaining respect for the art and traditions of the profession. Minako's life is a powerful testament to the tension between tradition and personal autonomy. It's a story of success and fame, yes, but it is also a story of struggle, of the profound sacrifice required to navigate a world where one's identity is often subsumed by the roles assigned by society. Minako's decision to leave the geisha world represents a bold assertion of personal freedom, a rejection of a life that demanded self-sacrifice, and a reclaiming of her own voice in a world that often tried to silence it. Her story is ultimately one of and true to oneself, while still honoring the tradition that shaped her. In this way, Minako's legacy is more than that of a geisha. It is the legacy of a woman who found the courage to step beyond tradition and live for herself, and, in doing so, left an indelible mark on the world of geishas, and on the broader cultural landscape. Her struggle and triumph will continue to resonate with those who seek to honor their past while embracing the freedom to live authentically. Minako Iwasaki's life is, in many ways, a metaphor for the human struggle to assert one's true self in a world that often demands conformity. Her story shows us that while we may be shaped by tradition, we are also capable of defining our own paths, of embracing our individuality, while still honoring the values that are important to us. It is this balance between honoring tradition and asserting personal freedom that is at the heart of Minako's legacy. The kimono garment with centuries of tradition has evolved from a simple garment to one of the most recognizable symbols of Japanese cultural identity. Its origins trace back to the Heian period, where early forms of what we now call the kimono were worn by the aristocracy. Initially, the garment was not the full-sleeved, elegantly fitted outfit we recognize today, but rather simpler clothing made from woven fabrics. However, the essence of the kimono as a formal and layered garment soon emerged during this period, influencing the fashion of the noble classes. The Heian period saw the development of layering techniques, where noble men and women wore multiple layers of silk garments to display their status, and the art of color coordination became a key element of the kimono. This would later be refined throughout Japanese history, especially in the Edo period, when the kimono became a significant element of Japanese identity. By this time, the kimono had become uniform attire for all classes, becoming a national symbol of Japanese beauty. As time passed, the kimono's evolution paralleled shifts in social structure and cultural values. For instance, in the Moji period, Western influence led to some modifications, but the kimono remained central to traditional ceremonies, important events, and, of course, the geisha profession. The kimono, therefore, came to represent not only a garment, but an enduring link to the past, and a symbol of national pride, as it embodied Japan's cultural heritage, even in the face of modernization. For the geishas, the kimono became a defining aspect of their public identity, marking their place within the social hierarchy and culture of Japan. In the world of the geisha, the kimono was more than a piece of clothing. It was a living representation of their art, their prestige, and their commitment to traditional beauty. The kimono is an intricately crafted garment, typically made from silk, brocade, cotton, or crepe. The materials used in making a kimono are not arbitrary. Each fabric is chosen for its aesthetic qualities, durability, and suitability for the wearer's social role. In the geisha world, the materials chosen for a kimono were closely tied to the geisha status and artistic mastery. Silk, often used for the highest quality kimonos, is the fabric most strongly associated with the kimono's history. The lustrous texture of silk was ideal for showcasing the detailed embroidery and decorative motifs that would come to symbolize a geisha's skill and status. Brocade, a luxurious fabric adorned with intricate raised patterns, was reserved for special occasions or for high-ranking geishas, symbolizing their prominence within the geisha hierarchy. The craftsmanship behind the kimono is nothing short of remarkable. The process of creating a kimono starts with weaving the fabric, which can take months of delicate labor. Traditional techniques like katagami and shibori were used to create unique patterns and designs on the fabric. Shibori is particularly known, as the process involves binding fabric with thread to create intricate patterns, then dyeing the fabric to form abstract or floral motifs. This technique, which demands precision and patience, can take days to complete and adds a layer of artistry to the fabric itself. The process of creating a kimono involves several specialized artisans, weavers, dyers, embroiderers, and tailors. Their collective craftsmanship elevates the kimono to more than just a piece of clothing. It becomes an art object, reflective of the values and aesthetics of its time. The geisha's kimono, therefore, becomes not only a garment but a work of art, telling a story of tradition, craftsmanship, and cultural legacy. Every element of the kimono is rich with meaning, particularly in the geisha tradition. The patterns and colors of the kimono are not simply decorative, they carry deep symbolic significance. In the geisha world, these symbols often spoke to the season, personality, or status of the wearer. For example, the cherry blossom is perhaps the most iconic motif used in geisha kimono, symbolizing beauty, feminine grace, and the ephemeral nature of life. The fleeting beauty of the sakura is a reminder of the transience of youth and beauty, a concept closely tied to the geisha world, where youth is both celebrated and fleeting. Similarly, plum blossoms symbolize resilience and strength, as these flowers bloom in the harshness of winter just as the geisha must, demonstrate strength and poise in the face of their demanding lives. Motifs like pine trees represent longevity and endurance, while the crane is a symbol of happiness, good fortune, and longevity, aligning with the desires for success and stability within a geisha's life. Butterflies are another frequent motif, often representing change, transformation, and personal growth. These symbols intertwine with the geisha's journey, where she is expected to constantly refine her craft while maintaining elegance, beauty, and mystique. As a geisha matures, her choice of patterns often reflects not only her artistic skills but also her experience and position within the geisha hierarchy. The use of gold leaf, silver threads, and more elaborate embroidery signifies a higher ranking, while simpler designs are often used by those still in training, or with a lower status. Thus, the kimono's patterning serves as a visual language, telling a story of the geisha's journey, status, and personal narrative. In feudal Japan, social rank was of paramount importance, and the kimono played a central role in visually communicating one's place within the hierarchy. The geisha world, although centered around artistic and cultural pursuits, was still firmly entrenched in the societal class system, and a geisha's kimono was often the first indicator of her status. Colors and patterns. The colors of a kimono were determined by the season, social status, and rank of the wearer. A young mako typically wore a kimono with bold colors, such as red and green, adorned with elaborate patterns like cherry blossoms or peacock feathers. These designs signified her youth, beauty, and potential. As the geisha matured, her kimono's colors became more muted, with darker shades like indigo, black, or blue, signaling a move into adulthood and professional mastery. The more muted tones reflected a sense of maturity, wisdom, and refined taste. Obi and knot style. The obi, the wide belt that is tied around the waist, was another key indicator of a geisha's rank. The way the obi was tied and the type of knot used spoke volumes about the wearer's status. A young mako might wear a large, brightly colored obi with an intricate knot, signaling youth and beauty. A more experienced geisha would wear a smaller, more refined obi with a subtle knot, reflecting a mature, elegant image. Material choice. The material of the kimono also played a critical role in signifying social status. Geishas of higher rank would wear kimonos made of luxurious silk brocade, often with hand-embroidered details. Low-ranking geishas, or mako still in training, would wear less expensive materials like cotton or rayon. Minako Iwasaki, for example, as one of the highest-ranking geishas in the Gion district, would have worn silk kimonos with rich patterns, symbolic of her place at the top of the geisha hierarchy. The kimono is not just a piece of clothing. It is a complex symbol of Japanese identity and cultural heritage. For the geisha, the kimono represents a lifetime of tradition, dedication, and it is a garment that speaks to social status, personal identity, and the cultural values of a society that demands both beauty and restraint. In Minaka's life, the kimono served as both a symbol of mastery reflecting her professional success as a top-tier geisha and the geisha kimono, in all its rich symbolism and layered meaning, encapsulated the internal tension between the geisha's public identity and her personal struggles for freedom and as we explore the evolution of the kimono from a garment of aristocratic origins to an emblem of artistry and prestige in the world of the geisha, it becomes clear that the kimono is not just a fashion statement. It is a deeply significant artifact of Japanese culture. The mako's kimono represents much more than just a piece of clothing. It is the visual embodiment of youth, potential, and the beginning of a journey. For mako, a young geisha in training, the kimono plays a crucial role in shaping her public image, her identity, and her connection to the geisha tradition. The mako kimono is typically bright, vibrant, and ornate, with long sleeves, which are a significant marker of her virginity, innocence, and youth. These long sleeves, known as furosode, signaled that she is still in the early stages of her career, and yet, to become fully immersed in the professional world of the geisha. The choice of colors and patterns in the mako kimono holds great significance, reflecting not only the season but also the geisha's youth and the promise she holds as she navigates her apprenticeship. Rich hues of reds, pinks, greens, and purples are often used, with bold motifs such as cherry blossoms, peacock feathers, and plum blossoms. Each of these motifs carries symbolic meaning. Cherry blossoms represent the fleeting nature of youth, while plum blossoms symbolize resilience and strength. Together, these patterns not only highlight the beauty and promise of the young mako, but also hint at the transience of her position in the geisha world and ephemeral stage before she matures into the fully formed geisha. The mako kimono is designed to be extravagant and emphasizing the youthful exuberance and potential of its wearer. The long sleeves and ornate decorations serve to make the mako stand out, almost like a flower in bloom, signaling that she is at the beginning of her journey. It is a garment that proclaims her promise and potential to ascend within the geisha hierarchy, and while it exudes beauty, it also carries with it a sense of anticipation, as the young apprentice is on the verge of mastering the complex artistry required to fully become a geisha. Change in attire upon becoming a geisha. Transition from youth to womanhood. As the mako completes her years of training, she is prepared for the transition to a fully fledged geisha. This pivotal moment is marked not only by the development of her artistic skills but also by a profound symbolic change in the way she is. When a mako graduates into the geisha role, her kimono undergoes a transformation that mirrors her growth as an artist, a woman, and a member of the geisha community. The most immediately obvious shift is in the sleeves of the kimono. As a mako, the long, dramatic sleeves of the furosode symbolize youth, virginity, and the boundless potential of a girl in training. However, upon becoming a geisha, these long sleeves are replaced by a shorter, more restrained sleeve, which marks her maturation and full transition into womanhood. The shortening of the sleeves signifies that the geisha is now considered a mature woman who has completed her apprenticeship and is now a professional in the traditional arts. This change in attire reflects the geisha's mastery of her craft, whether it be the shamisen dance or the delicate art of conversation. In addition to the sleeves, the colors of the kimono also become more subdued. While a mako's kimono may have been filled with bold colors and youthful exuberance, a geisha's kimono is often characterized by darker, more muted tones like black, navy blue, or ivory, which convey a sense of maturity, elegance, and refinement. The brightness that once characterized her attire is now replaced with understated grace, signaling her professionalism and her place within the geisha tradition. This shift is also a reflection of the geisha's maturity not just physically, but in her role as a respected artist and cultural icon. The change in attire, while seemingly superficial, is in fact a visual marker of the deeper emotional transformation that has taken place. It is not just about a change of clothes, it is about becoming a geisha stepping into a world of dedicated artistry, where the demands of the profession must now take precedence over the freedom and personal expression that were once more characteristic of her earlier mako days. The rituals of transition. Cutting the hair and donning the new kimono, the transition from mako to geisha, is underscored by a series of rituals, each symbolizing a key stage of the geisha's emotional and professional growth. One of the most profound and visually dramatic of these rituals is the cutting of the hair, a symbolic act that signifies her departure from youth and her official entrance into womanhood. During her time as a mako, the young woman's hair is worn in an elaborate, flowing style, often with ornate hairpieces. This style symbolizes her virginity and unmarried status, marking her as someone who is still in the process of developing and maturing. However, once she becomes a geisha, her hair is cut into a more refined, mature style, often worn in a small, neat bun. The shorn hairstyle represents the end of innocence and the beginning of a new, mature phase in her life as an artist. The act of cutting her hair is not only an external change but a reflection of the emotional maturation accompanies the transition from mako to geisha. The cutting of the hair symbolizes the geisha's readiness to take on the responsibilities of her new role. She is no longer a young girl, but a full-fledged professional. It is a visual sign of her commitment to the geisha life, where youthfulness gives way to refined artistry, and personal desires are increasingly subordinated to the demands of the profession. Alongside the change in hairstyle, the geisha's kimono also undergoes a dramatic transformation. The transition to a geisha kimono is not just about the colors and patterns, but about a profound shift in the wearer's identity. As a mako, her kimono was often adorned with lively patterns and bright colors, reflecting her youthful energy. However, once she becomes a geisha, the kimono adopts more elegant and sophisticated patterns, often more subtle and muted, signaling the transition from youthful exuberance to professional grace. This transition in both hairstyle and attire is deeply symbolic, as it marks the geisha's emotional and psychological shift. The shortened sleeves and darker hues of the kimono reflect not just a change in appearance, but a shift in the geisha's role within society. She is no longer an apprentice, but a master artist, expected to embody the elegance, restraint, and artistic dedication that the geisha profession demands. The transition from mako to geisha is much more than a simple change in attire or hairstyle. It is the outward manifestation of a deep, emotional, and professional transformation. The mako kimono, with its long sleeves, vibrant colors, and elaborate patterns, reflects the promise and youth of the geisha. But as she matures and becomes a full geisha, her kimono shifts to a more refined, subdued version, marking her transformation into a professional artist. The rituals associated with this transformation, the cutting of the hair and the change in kimono, serve as powerful symbols of the emotional maturation of the geisha, as she steps into her new role as a respected member of the geisha community. These rituals underscore the profound nature of the geisha's journey, where youth and innocence give way to maturity, artistic mastery, and a life dedicated to the preservation of traditional Japanese arts. In many ways, the mako's kimono and the subsequent geisha kimono serve as metaphors for the geisha's emotional and professional growth, from the exuberance of youth to the responsibility of artistic mastery. The transformation marked by the kimono is not just about the physical change in clothing. It is a symbol of the inner transformation that every geisha must undergo as she becomes part of a time-honored tradition that demands not just artistic ability but discipline, grace, and self-sacrifice. For Minako Iwasaki, the kimono was not merely a garment, but a symbol of the profound tension she experienced throughout her career as a geisha. The kimono, as the defining uniform of the geisha, was intricately tied to her status, her artistic identity, and her place in the rigid structure of the geisha world. However, while the kimono reflected the artistry and beauty of the geisha tradition, it also embodied the limitations and confinements of that very world. The geisha kimono, with its elegance and sophistication, was a mark of high status and expertise. As Minako's artistry blossomed, her kimono transformed to reflect the mastery of her skills, signifying her position at the top of the geisha hierarchy. The rich textures, luxurious fabrics, and meticulously woven patterns were not simply decorative. They were signs of her prestige and cultural importance within the geisha community. For Minako, the kimono was a mark of pride, a garment that celebrated her talent and professionalism. It represented the success she had worked tirelessly to achieve through years of training, discipline, and sacrifice. Yet, beneath the surface of beauty and prestige, the kimono also carried with it a deep sense of restriction physically, emotionally, and psychologically. The heavy layers of silk, the tight obi around the waist, and the intricate folds all required precise control of the body and movement. The garment demanded that the geisha remain composed, graceful, and restrained at all times. This external discipline mirrored the internal sacrifice demanded by the profession. The kimono's design required its wearer to embody the ideals of elegance and mystique, but it also reduced her ability to express herself freely. For Minako, the kimono became more than just clothing. It was a daily reminder of the social and personal boundaries she was confined to. While she performed for her patrons, maintaining the perfect image of artistry and mystique, the kimono reminded her that her role as a geisha was not one of personal autonomy, but of service to tradition and public expectation. The kimono, in its grandeur and beauty, symbolized both the prestige of her position and the emotional toll of living within the suffocating confines of the geisha world. Beyond its physical weight, the kimono carried a profound psychological burden for Min, particularly as she ascended to the highest ranks of the geisha community. Every day, the kimono was not just an article of clothing but a marker of the expectations that shaped her life and identity. The weight of the kimono was not simply in the fabric, it was the weight of perfection, the burden of maintaining an ideal that demanded constant sacrifice. As Minako donned the kimono, she was reminded not only of her professional obligations, but also of the psychological toll it took on her ability to live freely. The geisha kimono was a reminder that she was not fully her own person. She was bound to a role, an image, that was defined by tradition and expectations. The elaborate design, the careful arrangements of colors and patterns, the precise knot of the obi, each detail was a reflection of her identity as a geisha, but it also served as a marker of the emotional labor required to uphold that identity. The tightness of the obi, the weight of the kimono, and the effort to move gracefully within its constraints, began to symbolize the growing sense of suffocation that Minako felt within the geisha system. Each movement required deliberation and control, and every gesture had to adhere to an unwritten code of grace, beauty, and composure. This constant performance, the need to always appear graceful, mysterious, and refined, became a psychological burden. It demanded that Minako suppress personal expression and emotional authenticity in favor of maintaining the idealized geisha image. The kimono, as a physical embodiment of this performance, represented both the external expectations of her role and the internal conflict she felt as she grappled with the growing realization that her personal identity was being subsumed by the demands of the profession. As Minako grew more famous and her reputation as a top-tier geisha expanded, the pressure to maintain this perfect image and the weight of the kimono metaphorically and literally became more pronounced. Minako began to feel the psychological strain of constantly performing a role that no longer aligned with her true self. The kimono had once been a symbol of pride and artistic mastery, but over time, it transformed into a constant reminder of the emotional cost of her success. One of the most profound struggles in Minako's life as a geisha was the tension between her public identity as a geisha and her desire for personal autonomy. The kimono, in all its beauty and grandeur, symbolized this conflicted need to maintain an image of perfection and mystique, while also grappling with the desire to express herself as an individual outside of the rigid expectations of the geisha world. A geisha's identity is, by its very nature, constructed and curated. Every aspect of a geisha's life, from her dress to her behavior, from her speech to her movement, is. The kimono, as the primary representation of a geisha's outward appearance, was the embodiment of that external identity. Minako, as a highly successful geisha, was celebrated for her beauty, talent, but beneath the surface, she felt that this carefully constructed image was not an expression of her true self, but rather a role she had learned to perform to please others. The kimono, as both a visual symbol and a functional garment, represented the suppressive nature of the geisha role. While the geisha's kimono was designed to reflect her artistry, it also became a tool for maintaining an image that suppressed personal expression. Minako's life, as defined by the geisha system, demanded that she live up to an ideal of grace, perfection, and mystique, all while suppressing her individual desires and emotions. The geisha world, governed by strict rules and expectations, required that she constantly wear a mask, an act of self-sacrifice that required her to hide her true self beneath layers of tradition and performance. The struggle between self-expression and the geisha ideal is central to Minako's emotional conflict. As her fame grew, so did the pressure to maintain a persona that was completely separate from her authentic self. The kimono, with its layers and decorations, was a constant reminder of the emotional and psychological burden of maintaining this public image. Minako felt herself becoming more and more alienated from the woman beneath the kimono, the woman who wanted to express her individuality. The kimono became a metaphor for this internal battle. It was both an instrument of beauty and an imposition. While it symbolized the success and prestige she had achieved, it also reflected the emotional cost of adhering to a role that no longer aligned with her personal needs. The geisha kimono, with all its grace and splendor, became a mask that hid the real Minako, who yearned to break free from the restrictions of her role and embrace the freedom of personal expression. The kimono in Minako Iwasaki's life served as both a symbol of artistry and prestige, and a reminder of the emotional sacrifices required to maintain the role of a geisha. On the one hand, it represented the success, elegance, and professional mastery she had worked so hard to achieve. On the other hand, it came to embody the conflict and suppression of her true self, a self she could not fully express under the weight of the geisha tradition. The kimono's way, both physical and psychological, was a constant reminder of the tension between the geisha's public identity and her private struggles for personal autonomy. As Minako's fame grew, the kimono, which once symbolized her artistic mastery, became a symbol of the emotional cost of her success. It was no longer just a garment. It had transformed into a metaphor for the sacrifice of her individuality and the emotional burden of living up to an ideal that did not truly represent her authentic self. Ultimately, the kimono represents the duality of Minako's journey. It is both a symbol of beauty and artistry, and a marker of confinement and personal sacrifice. In many ways, it reflects the internal conflict of the geisha profession, where personal desires must often be subordinated to the demands of tradition and public expectation. The kimono is, therefore, not just an article of clothing but a reflection of the emotional toll of artistic mastery, and the struggle for autonomy within a tradition that often demands the suppression of individual identity. The kimono holds an indelible place in the heart of Japanese culture, functioning not just as a garment, but as an icon of national identity. It represents a timeless connection between the past and the present, woven into the cultural fabric of Japan itself. The kimono, with its long history, is seen as an embodiment of Japan's heritage, as it has been worn for over 1,000 years, evolving through the centuries to become a profound symbol of tradition, elegance, and national pride. Initially, in the Heian period, the kimono was primarily worn by the aristocracy and nobility, its design and color patterns indicating one's social rank and family lineage. Over time, however, the kimono became a garment worn by all classes, particularly during significant cultural events. In modern times, though Western-style clothing has become the norm for daily wear, the kimono remains deeply embedded in the cultural consciousness, worn with great respect during traditional ceremonies, holidays, and rites of passage. During weddings, for example, the shiramuku symbolizes purity and new beginnings. Traditionally, the bride wears a white kimono to signify her unblemished nature and readiness to embrace a new life. The bride's red obi, often richly embroidered with motifs of phoenixes or peonies, symbolizes good fortune, happiness, and the fertility of her marriage. This custom underscores the kimono's spiritual significance, as it is not only about fashion but a ceremonial marker that invokes the blessings of the gods and ancestors. Similarly, the kimono is a fixture in New Year celebrations, where people don formal kimonos to honor the passing of the old year and welcome the new one. It is a symbol of renewal, respect for tradition, and continuity. The brightly colored kimonos worn during the New Year celebrations, with their intricate patterns of plum blossoms, pine trees, and cranes, evoke prosperity, longevity, and good health. For the year to come, these garments, passed down through generations, carry the weight of tradition, creating an enduring cultural continuity that links the present to the past. In addition, the kimono continues to be worn during important family events, such as the Seijin Shiki and Obi. Each of these celebrations represents a deep connection to family and ancestors, where the kimono plays a vital role in reflecting the wearer's respect for their heritage. These cultural practices and ceremonies, preserved for centuries, demonstrate the kimono's role not just as clothing but as a marker of cultural identity and spiritual values that have shaped Japan. The kimono is, therefore, far more than just a piece of traditional clothing. It is a symbol of cultural continuity and personal connection to Japanese history. It transcends time and generations, carrying cultural meaning that binds the individual to the community, to their ancestors, and to the nation itself. Beyond its cultural symbolism, the kimono is also a masterpiece of artistic expression. Every kimono is crafted with exquisite care, requiring months or even years of painstaking work by skilled artisans. The craftsmanship that goes into creating a single kimono, from weaving to embroideries, a true reflection of Japan's dedication to art and beauty. The materials used in the kimono, such as silk, brocade, and cotton, are chosen not only for their aesthetic appeal, but also for their symbolism. Silk, in particular, is highly prized for its luster, softness, and elegance, conveying the refinement and luxury associated with the kimono. The weaving process itself, often done by hand, uses traditional techniques passed down through generations. Shibori, a tie-dyeing technique, creates delicate patterns in the fabric, while katagami is used to print intricate designs onto the kimono, such as flowers, birds, and landscapes, each of which carries symbolic meaning. In the creation of the kimono, there is a deep connection to Japanese aesthetic values, particularly the principles of wabi-sabi and mana no aware. Wabi-sabi, the appreciation of imperfection and the transience of beauty, is expressed through the subtle details of the kimono's craftsmanship. The soft, natural imperfections in the fabric, the slightly uneven dyes, and the fading of colors over time reflect the impermanence of life itself. The kimono's ability to age gracefully mirrors the Japanese philosophical notion that beauty is found not in perfection, but in the natural course of life. This appreciation for imperfection allows the kimono to become more meaningful as it ages, embodying the passing of time and the wisdom that comes with it. Mono no aware, the awareness of the fleeting nature of life, is another crucial principle embedded in the kimono. The patterns that adorn the kimono, such as cherry blossoms or cranes, reflect the impermanence of life and the beauty of ephemeral moments. Cherry blossoms, for example, are in bloom for only a short period, and their depiction on a kimono serves as a reminder of the transitory nature of existence, an artistic reflection on the fragility and beauty of life itself. The kimono, therefore, becomes not only a garment of cultural pride, but also a medium for expressing profound philosophical concepts about life, death, and beauty. The artistic freedom embedded in the design and crafting of the kimono is what makes it one of the most intricate and revered garments in the world. From hand-dyeing to embroidering intricate motifs, every aspect of the kimono is an expression of Japanese aesthetic philosophy. The kimono thus becomes a reflection of Japan's deep appreciation for beauty, simplicity, and the impermanent nature of life. The geisha kimono plays a unique role in how femininity is expressed in traditional Japanese society. The kimono, especially when worn by a geisha, is designed to accentuate feminine beauty in a highly stylized and refined manner. It is not an overtly sensual garment. Rather, it emphasizes grace, poise, and subtle elegance qualities that are highly valued in Japanese culture. The geisha's kimono is designed with the female form in mind, but rather than highlighting sexuality or revealing the body, it draws attention to the movement and posture of the woman. The flowing lines of the kimono create a sense of fluidity and grace, while the tight obi around the waist serves as a subtle reminder of the geisha's restrained beauty. This use of the kimono to express feminine beauty is not about sensuality or sexual allure, but about capturing the essence of womanhood in its most refined and restrained form. The long sleeves of the mako kimono, often adorned with elaborate embroidery and patterns, symbolize youth and innocence, as well as the potential for a woman's growth into maturity and artistic mastery. Once the Mako transitions into a full geisha, the shortened sleeves of the kimono mark the shift from innocence to experience. The kimono, in this way, reflects a maturation of both personal identity and social role, symbolizing the geisha's transition into womanhood, where grace and modesty take precedence over overt displays of sexuality. In the geisha world, the kimono becomes a tool for femininity, allowing women to express their beauty and feminine energy without resorting to overt sex. The decorative motifs such as flowers, birds, and butterflies are chosen for their associations with femininity, fragility, and grace, all of which contribute to the geisha's mystique and feminine appeal. The geisha kimono thus serves as a distinctive form of feminine expression, rooted in tradition, that both celebrates and conceals the feminine form in a uniquely Japanese manner. It allows women like Minako Iwasaki to express their feminine grace and artistic mastery, without undermining the decorum and modesty central to the geisha role. This interplay between restraint and elegance makes the geisha kimono not just a garment, but a profound statement of gender and beauty within the context of Japanese culture. The kimono stands as a symbol that is deeply intertwined with Japan's cultural identity, artistry, gender roles, and spiritual values. Its evolution from a practical garment to a symbol of national pride and artistic mastery speaks to its profound cultural significance. Beyond the geisha world, the kimono remains a key cultural icon, representing tradition, beauty, and the impermanence of life. Through its craftsmanship and symbolism, the kimono expresses the core principles of Japanese aesthetic. Philosopher particularly Wabi-sabi and Mano no Awares celebrating imperfection and the fleeting nature of beauty. The geisha kimono, in particular, offers a powerful lens through which to examine feminine expression, gender roles, and the tension between tradition and individuality. Ultimately, the kimono is not just an article of clothing, but a reflection of Japan's enduring cultural legacy, its connection to artistic traditions, and its unique approach to femininity. It is a garment that transcends time, continuing to serve as a living symbol of the values and beauty that define Japanese society. The kimono, particularly the geisha kimono, is not just a symbol of beauty and status. It is a garment that comes with significant physical discomfort. As much as the kimono is revered for its elegance, it is also known for the physical strain it places on its wearer. The most notable source of discomfort lies in the obi, the wide, tightly tied sash that wraps around the waist and holds the kimono in place. The obi is designed to create a sleek and structured silhouette, but this requires it to be fastened so tightly that it restricts the wearer's movement and breathing. For Minako, like other geishas, wearing the kimono meant contending with this physical tightness, which could cause significant discomfort. The obi was not just a decorative element, it was a structural component that demanded precision in its tying. It had to be arranged in exactly the right way to achieve the proper aesthetic. Symmetry in the folds, perfect positioning of the knot at the back, and a tightness that held everything in place. This constant pressure on her waist not only made physical movement difficult, but also served as a reminder of her professional identity. The tightness of the obi and the weight of the kimono were external markers of her role in society, reminding Minako that she was not an individual free to move as she wished, but rather a public persona whose identity was carefully constructed. In addition to the obi, the multiple layers of the kimono itself added weight and bulk, creating a sense of heaviness that Minako carried with her throughout the day. The layers of silk and fabric, designed for visual appeal, required constant adjustment, making every movement feel laborious. As she performed or walked, Minako had to adjust to the discomfort that came with the attire, ensuring that she carried herself with grace despite the physical restrictions placed upon her. This physical burden was not just a minor inconvenience, it was an essential aspect of the geisha-esque, the visible marker that reinforced the idea that the geisha-esque body was an instrument of her art and profession. The kimono, while beautiful, was also a tool of restriction, ensuring that the geisha was always in a state of aesthetic perfection, but at the cost of her personal comfort and physical freedom. The obsession with perfection, the external appearance over internal well-being. One of the most defining aspects of the geisha lifestyle is the constant attention to detail required in the presentation of the kimono. Every element of the garment, the folds, the fabric, the color alignment, the positioning of the obi, and even the way the sleeves draped had to be meticulously perfect. The emphasis on perfection was not just a matter of aesthetics. It was deeply tied to the geisha's identity as a symbol of refined artistry and discipline. In this world, the kimono became a visual language, speaking volumes about a geisha's status, training, and personal brand. For Minako, as a renowned geisha, there was an immense amount of pressure to ensure that every detail of her appearance was flawless. The kimono had to be arranged just right, with no folds out of place, no colors too bold or too muted. Even the way she carried herself, her posture, the way she moved, how she arranged her kimono sleeves. The exact positioning of her obi knot was constantly scrutinized by patrons, fellow geishas, and society at large. The perfection of her kimono was not only an artistic goal but a public expectation, one that demanded her constant attention and vigilance. In this context, the kimono became more than just a garment, it was a performance. Wearing it was not simply about dressing, it was about becoming a symbol of perfection. This relentless pursuit of visual flawlessness meant that Min and other geishas were often more concerned with maintaining external appearances than with their own emotional or physical well-being. In many ways, the kimono served as a barrier not only to the outside world but to the wearer, so in humanity. Emotion, self-expression, and individuality had to be suppressed in favor of the geisha persona, which required perfect control over one's outward presentation. The psychological toll of this pursuit of perfection meant that Minako often had to disregard her own needs and desires in favor of her role as a geisha. Her kimono, which was an emblem of her success, was also a marker of the emotional cost of that success. Every day, she wore a garment that made her feel like a work of art, beautiful, poised, and in complete control. But this same garment also meant that imperfection was unacceptable. The kimono demanded not only physical sacrifice but also the suppression of authentic self-expression. As Minako's career, she began to feel the psychological toll that came with the constant need to perform the geisha persona. The kimono, while beautiful and essential to her role, became a constant reminder of the emotional disconnect between her public identity as a geisha and her personal desires as an individual woman. The kimono, in its beauty and complexity, was the external manifestation of the internal battle that Minako faced daily. While the geisha's role demanded that she maintain a perfect facade, the kimono symbolized the emotional suppression that came with living a life dictated by others' expectations. The tied obi, the weight of the kimono, and the constant attention to detail forced Minako to prioritize external perfection over her personal comfort and authentic emotional expression. The geisha kimono, in all its delicacy and refinement, was a constant reminder that her true self had to be subordinated to the demands of tradition and performance. This internal conflict was particularly acute for Minako, as she achieved the pinnacle of success in her career. The kimono, once a symbol of her artistry and pride, began to feel like a prison. It represented not only the grace and poise that were expected of her, but also the emotional sacrifices that came with living in a role that required constant control over her identity and emotions. Each day, the kimono served as a reminder that the geisha persona was not just a role, it was a performance that demanded her full participation while requiring her to suppress the parts of herself that did not fit within the idealized image of the perfect geisha. The psychological toll of wearing the kimono became unbearable at times. The constant need to uphold the geisha's image, mystique, and artistic perfection left Minako feeling estranged from her own sense of self. The kimono became both a symbol of her success and a barrier to her personal freedom. The more she perfected her public persona, the more she felt disconnected from the woman underneath, whose desires, emotions, and individuality were stifled by the constant need to perform. The kimono was not just a garment that she wore, it was a burden that she carried, a constant reminder that her life was no longer her own, but rather the sum of society's expectations and the geisha system that governed her every move. For Minako, the kimono became both a symbol of external perfection and an emotional prison that confined her true self. The kimono in Minako's life represented both the pride and pain of her existence as a geisha. On one hand, it was a garment of artistic excellence, a symbol of beauty, discipline, and success. It reflected her achievements in the geisha world and the prestige she earned through years of rigorous training and sacrifice. However, on the other hand, the kimono also served as a constant reminder of the emotional cost of that success, the physical discomfort, the psychological toll, and the sacrifices she made to maintain the geisha persona. The kimono was a symbol of tradition and social expectation, but it also represented the struggle for autonomy and authenticity. In the end, for Minako, the kimono was not just a garment she wore, but a metaphor for the duality of her life, beautiful unburdened, prestigious and restrictive, graceful and suffocating. It is a garment that encapsulated the sacrifices of her profession and the conflict between external perfection and the suppressed inner self, a conflict that would ultimately drive her to break free from the geisha world and reclaim her voice and identity. The geisha kimono transcends its role as mere clothing, becoming a symbol of duty, a powerful reflection of the responsibilities a geisha has toward her house, her patrons, and the traditions she upholds. As Minako Iwasaki advanced in her career, the kimono became inextricably tied to her professional identity. It was not just a tool for artistic expression, but a uniform of expectation that demanded strict adherence to the roles and responsibilities laid out by the geisha system. The kimono symbolizes a geisha's duty to the geisha space where young women are trained in the ancient arts of shamisen, playing dance and tea ceremonies, and where they are expected to embody the virtues of grace, elegance, and restraint. It is a mark of association with the Hausa commitment to the collective mission of preserving and promoting the geisha tradition. As Minako advanced from being a Meiko to a full-fledged geisha, the kimono became more elaborate, signaling her increasing mastery of the arts and her growing responsibility to maintain the high standards of the geisha world. The exquisite craftsmanship of the kimono, with its intricate patterns and delicate fabric, reflected the dedication required to achieve the artistic excellence expected of a top-tier geisha. The kimono, with its elaborate designs and precise tailoring, spoke to the mastery she had acquired through years of intense training, but it also underscored her responsibility to live up to the standards set by her elders and men. The geisha kimono also serves as a tool of expectation for wealthy and influential men who frequent the tea houses and engage with the geisha. The kimono plays a central role in creating the perfect illusion of mystique and grace, which is central to the geisha's appeal. For men, wearing the kimono meant embodying a character that was carefully curated to meet the aesthetic demands of her patrons. And this burden of expectation is ever present. The kimono, therefore, served as a constant reminder of her duty to those who supported her career and her geisha hausan obligation to perform flawlessly. In many ways, the kimono becomes a constant marker of external responsibility, one that aligns with her duty to uphold the geisha tradition. Its presence acts as both a privilege and a constraint, an embodiment of the expectations of society, the house, and the patrons that every geisha must serve and satisfy. The geisha kimono symbolizes not just in the way it demands physical discipline, but in the emotional and psychological cost it imposes on the geisha. As Minako advanced in her profession, the kimono came to represent a life of perfection, a life where personal freedom, identity, and emotion were sacrificed for the sake of artistic mastery and social expectations. For a geisha, the constant pressure to be perfect in appearance, behavior, and skill was compounded by the demands of the kimono. The geisha kimono required near constant attention, from its careful folding to its flawless arrangement on the body. Each fold of fabric had to be perfectly aligned, each pattern had to be symmetrical, and the obi had to be tied exactly right. Any deviation from perfection would be noticed and judged, often harshly, by both patrons and peers alike. The kimono, therefore, was not just a garment to be worn. It was an instrument of perfection, a tool that demanded attention to detail and commitment to craft. This pursuit of perfection came at a high emotional cost. For Minako, the constant need to maintain flawless performance, whether it was playing the shamisen, performing a dance, or simply maintaining her composure during a conversation, required immense self-control. The kimono was both a physical and psychological reminder that she could not afford to. Identity as a geisha was based on the careful maintenance of this perfect image. In addition to the physical burden of the kimono, there was also the emotional toll of constantly having to suppress personal identity. The kimono served as a symbol of this sacrifice, a constant reminder that her true self was secondary to the role she had to play. The kimono, as it enveloped her body, also enveloped her emotional state, making it difficult to reconcile her inner desires with the demands of her professional life. The self-sacrifice of a geisha, represented by the kimono, was a commitment to perfection at the expense of personal freedom and expression. The kimono became a manifestation of the psychological conflict that Minako, like many geishas, experienced throughout her career. As a geisha, Minako was expected to be the epitome of grace, beauty, and restraint, qualities that were visually symbolized by the geisha kimono. But as she advanced in her profession, she began to feel the disconnect between the persona she projected and the authentic self she carried within. Wearing the kimono, with its tight obi, layered fabric, and meticulously arranged folds, was a daily reminder of her external persona. It reinforced the geisha Roland identity that had been carefully shaped by the expectations of society, tradition, and patron. However, as Minako grew in stature, she began to question the cost of this external perfection. The kimono, which once symbolized her success and professionalism, became a symbol of her entrapment within a system that demanded sacrifice of her personal self. The emotional burden of living as a geisha role that required constant performance was made heavier by the kimono, which continually reinforced her need to perform in a very specific way. The kimono's perfect folds, its intricate designs, and its formal style were a visual representation of the emotional restraint required of Min. The geisha kimono was not just a garment, it was a reminder of her subordination to an idealized image of perfection that was not truly hers, but rather the product of societal expectations. The psychological toll of wearing the kimono was immense. It represented the masks that Minako had to wear to maintain her position in the geisha world, masks, mystique, and composure, but behind the beauty of the kimono lay a woman whose true desires and emotions were often buried beneath the weight of her role. The kimono, therefore, became a visual metaphor for the internal conflict Minako faced between her professional identity as a geisha and her authentic self, which she began to long for more as the years went on. The kimono's physical and psychological demands were unrelenting, forcing Minako to live a life of duality, one that required her to maintain a perfect external image while suppressing her true identity. As the years wore on, the kimono, once a symbol of her artistic success, became a reminder of the sacrifices she had made and ultimately, the self-sacrifice required to achieve and maintain the title of a geisha. The geisha kimono serves as a powerful symbol of the mastery, duty, and self-sacrifice that defines a geisha's life. For Minako, the kimono was a marker of achievement, representing the artistic success she had worked tirelessly to achieve. It signified her commitment to the geisha tradition, her duty to her house, and her dedication to the art of performance. Yet, the kimono also carried with it a profound psychological cost. The constant pressure to wear it perfectly, to perform the geisha persona, and to suppress her true self left Minako feeling trapped in a life that demanded sacrifice of her personal freedom, identity, and emotions. The geisha kimono therefore becomes a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it is a symbol of success and artistic mastery. On the other, it is a constant reminder of the self-sacrifice required to uphold the idealized image of the perfect geisha. For Minako, the kimono was both a badge of honor and a burden, representing both the privilege of her position and the emotional cost of the life she had chosen. Minako Iwasaki's decision to leave the geisha world in 1975 was a monumental act of personal liberation, a deliberate and symbolic rejection of a life built on years of tradition, conformity, and external expectations. The act of shedding her kimono was not just a physical transition. It was a powerful metaphor for the emotional and psychological shedding of the burdens and limitations that had defined her existence for so long. For years, the kimono had been her second skin, enveloping her body in layers of silk, fabric, and ornate patterns, signifying both her artistic mastery and her subjugation to the strict codes of the geisha system. Each layer of the kimono, every intricate detail, symbolized the expectations placed upon her not just as a geisha, but as a performer, caretaker, and symbol of tradition. The kimono was a visible sign of her duty to the geisha house, her patrons, and the cultural heritage she had been entrusted with. It represented both honor and sacrifice, a commitment that demanded perfection at the cost of her personal freedom. By leaving the geisha world, Minako symbolically removed the kimono, the garment that had represented the external persona of a geisha, tied to societal expectations of beauty, mystique, and grace. The act of leaving marked her emancipation from the invisible chains that bound her to the rigid roles defined by her profession. No longer would she be restricted by the constraints of the geisha identity that the kimono had come to embody. The kimono, once a symbol of prestige, now represented the weight of an unwanted identity. Her departure from the geisha world marked a turning point, not just professionally, but emotionally. She freed herself from the heavy expectations of perfection, the constant need to perform in a role that had become unnatural to her. The kimono, once worn with pride, was now seen as a reminder of the emotional cost of her success. In choosing to leave, Minako symbolically shed that burden and chose to define herself outside of the confines of the geisha tradition. This moment of freedom was not just the end of her career as a geisha, but the beginning of her life as an individual, a woman who could now express her true self outside of the restrictive silk layers of the kimono. It was as if Minako had taken off the kimono and left behind the artificial mask she had worn for years, revealing the woman beneath a woman who had dreams, wants, and a life that did not require her to suppress her identity for the sake of a role dictated by societal expectation. The symbol of the kimono in Minako's liberation, a rejection of societal expectation. When Minako decided to leave the geisha profession, she was not simply rejecting a job, she was rejecting a system that had defined her existence. The kimono, as a physical manifestation of the geisha role, symbolized her entrapment within the world of public performance and the need for perfection. By discarding the kimono, Minako was symbolically rejecting the societal expectations that had constrained her for so long. In her decision to leave, the kimono no longer represented the tradition she had once embraced with reverence. Instead, it became a symbol of the external pressures and emotional costs of living a life in service of the geisha system. The very act of liberation was about more than just leaving a profession, it was about regaining control over her own identity. The kimono, which had once represented artistic achievement and social prestige, now came to symbolize a life that wasn't her own, a life dictated by others' expectations, not by her own desires. Leaving the kimono behind was a powerful expression of autonomy. As Minako freed herself from the role of the perfect geisha, she also shed the constraints that had kept her from expressing her true self. The kimono had been a visual marker of her status as a geisha, but it was also a constant reminder that she was living for others, whether her mentors or the geisha system itself. In reclaiming her freedom, Minako was not only rejecting the kimono, but also rejecting the very identity it had imposed upon her. She was now able to live without the burden of perfection, to find joy in her own voice, and to build a life that was defined by her true desires. Minako's decision to step away from the geisha world and the kimono became a personal revolution, declaration that she would no longer allow the garment of tradition to define her. By shedding the kimono, she symbolically shed the role that had become a prison, allowing her to reconnect with the woman beneath the performance. It was an act of self-assertion where Minako reclaimed her autonomy and chose to live according to her own values and dreams. Minako's decision to leave the geisha world was not an abrupt departure from a job, it was an expression of her need for personal autonomy and self. The kimono, once an emblem of success and honor, came to represent the cost of her success, a constant reminder of the role she had been forced to play. By removing the kimono and stepping out of the geisha world, Minako symbolically freed herself from the emotional and psychological chains that had bound her for years. She was no longer a prisoner of tradition, but an individual with the freedom to choose her own path. Her exit from the geisha world was an empowerment moment, where the kimono, the ultimate symbol of her public identity as a geisha, no longer held power over her. This was not just the end of her career, but the beginning of a new chapter where she could define herself outside the confines of her professional persona. Minako's departure was about more than just rejecting the geisha kimono. It was about rejecting the entire system that required her to live a life of constant performance, self-restraint, and emotional suppression. In leaving the geisha world, Minako's autonomy was no longer would she wear the kimono to represent a role that wasn't truly hers. Instead, she would wear it as a memory, a symbol of her past, but no longer as an anchor to a life she no longer wished to lead. The kimono, in its intricate design and weight, was both a testament to her achievements and a reminder of her personal sacrifices. Her liberation was not just a physical removal of the kimono, but an emotional liberation from a life defined by the expectations and constraints of the geisha profession. The kimono, in its beauty, elegance, and cultural significance, played an integral role in Minako Iwasaki's journey through the geisha world. It was a symbol of both her success and her subjugation, a garment that reflected the external expectations placed on her by the geisha system and society. However, in the end, the kimono became a visual representation of the emotional cost of her success. The decision to shed the kimono, both physically and symbolically, marked the beginning of Minako's journey toward personal freedom, where she could finally define her own identity and live authentically. Her departure from the geisha world was not just a rejection of the kimono, rejection of the entire system that bound her to a role that no longer resonated with her true self. By freed from the constraints of the kimono and the geisha identity, Minako reclaimed her voice, her independence, and her right to. Through this journey, the kimono evolved from a symbol of duty to a symbol of liberation, representing the emotional and psychological transformation that Minako underwent as she freed herself from the burdens of tradition and embraced her true identity. The kimono stands as an enduring cultural icon, a symbol of Japanese identity, tradition, and heritage. Far beyond being a mere garment, the kimono embodies the very essence of Japanese cultural values, including elegance, aesthetic appreciation, and the respect for history. As one of the most revered garments in the world, the kimono carries the weight of centuries of tradition, passed down through generations, and continues to serve as a profound representation of the values that define Japan. The kimono's role is not confined to the geisha world alone, while it is inextricably linked to the art of geisha performance, where it embodies grace, artistry, and the refinement of centuries. Cultural practices, it is also a symbol of national identity worn during ceremonies, festivals, and important family events like weddings, New Year celebrations, and coming-of-age rituals. The kimono serves as a bridge between Japan's rich cultural history and its contemporary identity, encapsulating the balance between preserving tradition and adapting to modernity. Yet, while the kimono is a timeless symbol of artistic mastery, it also represents the sacrifices made by those, like Minako, who dedicated themselves to living by its code. The geisha kimono, with its strict rules of appearance, movement, and presentation, was not simply a garment of beauty, but a tool of self-discipline. For the women who wore it, it was an enduring symbol of the emotional costs associated with their roles: emotional suppression, loss of autonomy, and the perpetual struggle to maintain perfection. For Minako, the kimono became a reminder of the physical and psychological toll of embodying a persona that, at times, felt alien to her authentic self. The kimono preserved the traditions of the geisha world, but for those who lived within its constraints, it often became a symbol of personal sacrifice, a reminder of the tension between duty and individual freedom. In Minako's journey, the kimono is a visual representation of the emotional conflict she faced in balancing her public persona with the need to break free from the confines of her traditional role. Minako Iwasaki's story is ultimately one of navigating the complex relationship between tradition and individuality. As a young girl, the kimono was a marker of her place within the geisha tradition, a symbol of the training she would undergo, the discipline she would adopt, and the artistic mastery she would achieve. Yet, as she rose through the ranks to become one of the most famous geishas in Japan, the kimono also became a prism of visual representation of the expectations and constraints of the geisha profession. Minako's decision to leave the geisha world in 1975 and reject the kimono as part of her daily identity was a profound act of liberation. It marked the end of her role as a perfectly composed geisha, and the beginning of her journey toward autonomy. By removing the kimono, she symbolically shed the identity that had been crafted for her, breaking free from the societal expectations that had once defined her. The kimono, though it remained a part of her legacy, was no longer a tool of emotional sacrifice, but rather a memory, a reminder of her growth, struggles, and eventual emancipation. Yet, despite the painful memories associated with the kimono, it remains an indelible part of Minako's story. It will forever be tied to the artistic mastery she displayed throughout her career, the dedication she poured into her craft, and the persona she performed. The kimono, as a symbol of the geisha's role, will always be part of Minako's legacy, reflecting both her achievements and the sacrifices she made in her quest for personal freedom. Minako's journey illustrates the complex interplay between tradition and individuality, how the kimono, a garment steeped in centuries of cultural significance, became both a symbol of artistic mastery and a reminder of the emotional cost of conformity. By reclaiming her autonomy and sharing her story, Minako gave voice to the struggle many geishas face between fulfilling their duties and seeking their true selves. The kimono, then, becomes more than just an article of clothing. It is a powerful metaphor for the geisha's struggle, and, as the geisha world evolves, so too does the legacy of the kimono. For Minako, the kimono will always be a part of her story, not just as a geisha, but as a woman who chose to live authentically, free from the constraints of tradition that once defined her. The kimono will always symbolize her artistry, her success, and her journey. But it will also be a symbol of self-liberation, a reminder of the costs of living in a system that demands sacrifice. Today, the kimono still holds great cultural and artistic significance, but it also serves as a symbol of how traditions evolve, how individuals navigate the tension between expectation and personal freedom, and how each generation must define for itself what it means to honor tradition while embracing change. Minako's legacy is not just about geisha artistry, but about the bravery to break free from the roles imposed by others and live life on her own terms, unshackled from the weight of the kimono and the identity it once represented. As Minako Iwasaki's journey demonstrates, the kimono will always be a symbol of her past, the beauty, sacrifice, and strength. She embodied as a geisha, but it also marks her ultimate freedom, the decision to live a life that is her own. In this way, the kimono remains both a legacy and a lesson, reminding us that the most powerful act of all is the choice to define oneself beyond the expectations of tradition. In the structured social hierarchy of feudal Japan, the geishas occupied a unique and important place. The social order was rigidly defined, with the samurai at the top, followed by nobles, merchants, and artisans, with peasants at the bottom. This hierarchy created a distinct divide between those who wielded military power, like the samurai, and those who contributed to the cultural and artistic spheres of society, such as the geisha. The geisha system developed in the Edo period, at a time when Japan's feudal society was governed by the Tokugawa shogun. This period of peace allowed the arts, including theater, literature. The geishas, as skilled performers, became integral to elite culture, providing both entertainment and cultural enrichment to Japan's aristocracy. The elite patrons, wealthy samurai nobles, and influential businessmen sought out geishas as symbols of prestige. The geishas' performances in private tea houses or during banquets were not merely forms of entertainment but rather social rituals, designed to reinforce and enhance the status of those who engaged them. For these patrons, interacting with a geisha was often as much about elevating their own position in the social hierarchy as it was about enjoying the artistry that the geishas offered. What made the geisha-s role particularly complex was the duality between the public persona they were expected to present and the private nature of the world they inhabited. While geishas were entertainers by trade, their role required them to embody grace, beauty, and a kind of emotional distance, qualities that fit neatly into the elite society's expectations. In contrast, their patrons, who often came from a world of military, political, or financial power, maintained a more private, secluded life. Their interactions with geishas offered them a space for emotional expression, refinement, and indulgence, all while still preserving their aura of control and status. This contrast between public performance and private wealth created a fascinating dynamic between the geishas and their patrons, one that was often marked by both mutual dependence and social expectations. For the elite patrons, the life of a geisha was something of a paradox. These wealthy samurai nobles and businessmen were often at the top of the feudal hierarchy, wielding tremendous power in local governance or commerce. Yet, they sought something quite different from the geishas, an escape from the rigid structures of their own worlds into a realm of art and refinement. This need for entertainment, combined with the opportunity to assert dominance through their choice of geisha companions, made the geisha's presence highly coveted. The patrons often lived lives marked by luxury and formality. Their days were typically filled with administrative duties, whether managing lands or overseeing businesses. But their evenings offered an opportunity for relaxation, indulgence, and social connection. Tea houses, where geishas performed, were exclusive spaces where patrons could retreat from the pressures of their positions to indulge in the company of geishas. For the samurai, who were bound by strict codes of conduct and had little space for personal expression, the geisha-s ability to provide artistic performances and personal companionship allowed them to connect to a world of emotional and aesthetic indulgence that was otherwise unavailable to them. For nobles and businessmen, geishas were also important in networking, providing a way to enhance social status and prestige in both personal and public spheres. A night spent with a famous geisha could be used to cement relationships with other members of the elite and demonstrate one's cultural sophistication. In this context, patrons not only funded the lives of geishas, but also validated their roles in society. The financial patronage was essential to the geisha's livelihood, while at the same time, patrons derived social capital from their association with the geisha's beauty, grace, and talent. This created an interdependent system where both parties gained something crucial from the relationship. However, this system also came with its limitations, as the geishas had to conform to patrons' desires, sometimes even at the expense of their own emotional well-being. The nature of the patron-geisha relationship was deeply rooted in mutual expectation. The geishas were expected to perform flawlessly not only through their art, but also in their personal demeanor. The patrons, in return, expected to be treated with honor, grace, and respect, though often their expectations went beyond the artistic realm. They wanted a geisha's company to be a reward, a display of their power and elevated status. The geisha, in turn, had to manage this fine balance between being a servant of sorts, offering up their time, company, and skills to their patrons, and retaining some degree of autonomy. This often involved navigating an environment of emotional labor, where the geisha's feelings were secondary to the needs of the patron. The kimono, for example, was not just a symbol of artistry, but also a prison of expectation, its layers often signifying the emotional restraint required from the geisha. While the geisha's art was celebrated, their personal needs were often suppressed in service to a patron's desires. This divide was central to the geisha system. As the patrons sought validation through the company of a beautiful geisha, they were able to indulge in the luxury of artistic performances without any expectation of emotional investment beyond the superficial. For the geisha, however, maintaining this public role often meant the sacrifice of personal identity. The geisha's kimono, laden with expectations of perfection, symbolized this dichotomy. It was both a sign of status for the patron and a weight of expectation for the geisha, an expectation that she must be perfect, gracious, and mysterious, yet never truly herself. The patron's role in the geisha system was not just about providing the geishas with opportunities for artistic expression. It was also about reinforcing the power structures that kept the geishas in their place. Patrons maintained a certain ownership over the geisha's identity by controlling the access they had to her time, attention, and performances. This dynamic created a divide between the geisha's public role as entertainers and their private lives and autonomy. Even though they were revered for their talents, the geishas could not freely express themselves in the way their patrons did. In this way, the elite patrons held the power to define the geisha's world, ensuring that her identity was largely shaped by patronage and the demands of the social structure they represented. The geisha's role as a public entertainer often came at the expense of her own autonomy, as she navigated a world of constant performance for the approval of those who paid for her company and art. The geisha system in feudal Japan represented a fascinating intersection of art, prestige, and social dynamics. For the elite patrons, the geishas were symbols of luxury and cultural sophistication, a mark of their elevated status in society. Yet, this relationship was complex and fraught with tension, as the geishas were tasked with fulfilling both the artistic and emotional needs of their patrons while suppressing their own desires for personal autonomy. The patrons of the geishas held significant power within this system, as they were the ones who provided financial support and validation. Yet, their power also reinforced a rigid structure that often kept geishas in a state of emotional labor and performance, their true selves hidden behind the layers of silk and expectations. The geishas' artistry was celebrated, but the cost of their success was significant, sacrificing their personal freedom and emotional independence to fulfill the role that society had crafted for them. In examining the relationship between the geisha and her patron, one sees the inherent conflict between public service and personal autonomy. The kimono, as a garment of beauty, artistry, and perfection, was both a tool for public performance and a symbol of the emotional burden that came with being a geisha. The patrons, while enabling the geisha's success, also maintained a structure that demanded sacrifice, creating a paradox that shaped both their lives. The role of the geisha within elite circles of feudal Japan was complex, multifaceted, and deeply intertwined with the social dynamics of the time. Geishas were not merely entertainers in the traditional sense. They were cultural facilitators, playing an essential role in enhancing the social experiences of the wealthy patrons who sought their company. Their art, whether it was shamisen music, traditional dance, or tea ceremonies, was far more than just a display of skill. It was a medium through which patrons experienced refinement, elegance, and intellectual stimulation. Geishas performed in exclusive venues like tea houses, banquets, and private gatherings, environments where elite men gathered not only to enjoy the arts, but also to assert their status and refine their social connections. These interactions were structured within the context of cultural rituals, where art, conversation, and emotional connection were carefully woven together to create an atmosphere of exclusivity and sophistication. In these settings, the geishas were expected to embody grace and mystique, walking the fine line between offering intimate companionship and maintaining emotional distance. Unlike other entertainers, geishas were expected to be reserved and enigmatic, their mystique a central element of their appeal. Patrons wanted more than a performance. They desired the illusion of closeness without any genuine emotional connection. This created a delicate balance, as the geishas had to provide emotional support, offer companionship, and engage in intellectual discourse, all while preserving an air of emotional detachment. Geishas were called upon to provide solace and spiritual companionship, offering an emotional escape for the often stressed, powerful patrons who sought relief from the burdens of their high-status lives. Through conversation, musical performance, and dance, they allowed these men to experience catharsis, but always within the boundaries of propriety. The emotional labor that the geishas performed was silent but profound, as they maintained an outer facade of composure, while constantly adapting to the emotional needs of the men they entertained. The power dynamics between a patron and a geisha were fraught with both subtle manipulation and mutual dependence. The patron had the power to provide economic support, validate a geisha's reputation, and elevate her status in the geisha world, but in return, the geisha was expected to deliver an emotional performance that catered to the patron's desires. At the heart of these relationships was a distinct set of expectations that were both explicit and implicit, based on the role the geisha was required to play. Patrons often requested musical performances, poetry, recitations, and traditional dances. These performances, while artistic, were also charged with expectations of beauty and restraint. Patrons demanded that geishas play the roles of both artists and companions, with all the grace and allure expected of a top-tier entertainer, while also embodying a sense of profound emotional distance. The geisha's behavior was scrutinized meticulously. Her manners, speech, and even her gestures had to be controlled and performed flawlessly. The artistic performances of the geisha were not simply for aesthetic pleasure. They were designed to project an idealized version of femininity and beauty. Whether playing the shamisen, performing a traditional dance, or serving tea in a ceremony, each act was imbued with emotional labor. The geisha's role was to make the patron feel special, important, and appreciated, while never revealing too much of her own emotional world. The patron's needs, their desire for intellectual stimulation, emotional connection, and artistic enjoyment were to be met without the geisha ever crossing the boundaries of professional detachment. In this relationship, the geisha had to suppress her own desires to meet the needs of the patron. The subtle emotional manipulation involved in creating this balance is what made the geisha's art so intricate and difficult. It required constant self-discipline and emotional resilience, as the geisha had to maintain an air of unattainability, while simultaneously providing the emotional solace her patron sought. The kimono, with its elegant folds and layers, symbolized this duality, publicly graceful, yet internally binding, restricting the geisha's true emotional expression. One of the most important aspects of the patron-geisha dynamic was the emotional labor demanded of the geisha. In contrast to the patrons, who could indulge their desires and engage in self-expression through the exchange, the geisha was required to hide her emotions and suppress her identity to maintain her role. While the patrons were seen as the source of power in these relationships, the geishas held a unique form of power, the power to curate emotional experiences and aesthetic performances. Geishas had to compartmentalize their emotions to serve their patrons' needs, whether performing a beautiful shamisen piece or engaging in subtle conversation. The geisha was tasked with performing an emotional labor that went beyond just the physicality of playing an instrument or dancing. The geisha's ability to create a moment of intimacy without actually becoming emotionally involved was the core of her art. The patron's expectations were more than just artistic. They demanded emotional performance as well, often in the form of attention, affection, and mystique. But this emotional performance often came at the cost of the geisha's personal identity. The emotional sacrifice required of the geisha was immense, having to maintain an idealized image of beauty and grace, while simultaneously suppressing personal desires, fears, and hopes. As Minako and other geishas would later reflect, this emotional disconnect created a psychological burden. In her role as an entertainer, a companion, and a muse, the geisha was expected to fulfill every need of her patron, often at the expense of her own emotional well-being. The patron-geisha relationship was marked by a unique blend of mutual dependence and emotional labor. The patrons relied on the geishas for artistic performance, companionship, and emotional release, while the geishas depended on their patrons for financial support, status, and cultural validation. Yet, this relationship also came with significant emotional cost for the geishas. They were required to maintain emotional detachment and professionalism at all times, suppressing their own desires and emotions to meet the expectations of their elite patrons. For Minako and many other geishas, the art of emotional labor became an essential, yet taxing, part of their professional lives. They were cultural artists embodying grace and beauty, but At times, this artifice could feel like a prison. The kimono, a symbol of the geisha's status and role, became a visual metaphor for this dual existence. It was a reminder of both the prestige the geisha had achieved and the emotional distance she had to maintain. In the world of elite patrons and geishas, the delicate balance between artistry, emotional labor, and self-sacrifice created a complex and often difficult dynamic, where the geisha's true selves were hidden beneath the layers of performance. As Monaco's journey shows, this tension between personal identity and public role could be deeply burdensome, ultimately leading some geishas, like her, to seek freedom from the constraints of a life that demanded constant emotional sacrifice. The relationship between a geisha and her patrons in feudal Japan was inherently transactional, blending the worlds of artistry and commerce. On the one hand, this system was a financial exchange. Patrons paid for the geisha's company, performances, and artistry, contributing to their livelihood and success. On the other hand, the exchange was also deeply rooted in cultural value, where prestige, status, and social capital were the primary currencies. For the geishas, their art, whether it was the mastery of the subtlety of tea ceremonies, or the beauty of traditional dance, was the very commodity that defined their value in the world. Their performances were not simply about entertainment. They were about creating an atmosphere of refinement and elegance that elevated the status of the patrons they served. In exchange for their artistic performances, the geishas were provided with financial support, social status, and a place in high society. For elite patrons, having a geisha, especially one who was accomplished in the traditional arts, was a badge of honor. It was a mark of sophistication, showing that they had access to the highest echelon of cultural society. Their ability to commission or invite a top-tier geisha to perform in their tea banquet or private gathering symbolized their elevated position within the social hierarchy. It wasn't just about enjoying an evening of beautiful art. It was about projecting wealth, taste, and social prominence. This exchange, while financially lucrative for the geisha, also reinforced the status and social power of the elite patrons. The system of patronage that underpinned the geisha world created a complex dynamic. Wealthy patrons would often establish long-term relationships with geishas, treating them not just as artists but also as cultural investments. These relationships would frequently extend beyond a single evening of performance, with the patrons continuing to support their favorite geishas over time. This created a sense of loyalty and dependence between the two parties. While the geishas received financial support, their patrons relied on their performances for both personal enjoyment and social prestige. This long-term patronage system meant that geishas like Monaco were not only financially dependent on their relationships with elite patrons, but also culturally bound to them. The success of a geisha often hinged on her ability to consistently deliver exceptional performances, and the loyalty she inspired in her patrons played a significant role in her career trajectory. For Monaco, her art became her source of income and her path to recognition within the geisha world. But the emotional and personal costs of this transactional relationship were significant, as the geishas had to serve their patrons' artistic and emotional needs, while maintaining a sense of professional distance. For Monaco Iwasaki, like all Tapti geisha, her art was a form of social capital, a source of income, and a means of elevating her standing in elite circles. The shamisen music she played, the traditional dances she performed, and the tea ceremonies she mastered were more than just acts of artistic expression. They were marketable skills that kept her in high demand among the elite patrons. The skills she honed throughout her training not only provided her with a livelihood, but also gave her the ability to secure her position in a competitive world where many young women vied for the attention and patronage of wealthy men. Through her art, Monaco gained financial independence and prestige. The patronage she received from wealthy men allowed her to flourish in the world of geisha, but it also came with its own set of expectations. She was constantly required to perform at a level of excellence, not only in her technical abilities but in her demeanor and social interactions. Her art was also a measure of her worth, and maintaining this excellence was integral to both her professional success and her social standing. But Monaco's art was more than just a source of income. It was also a form of social capital that allowed her to build relationships with the elite patrons. As a well-respected and sought-after geisha, her presence at social gatherings signified her patrons' ability to access the highest level of Japanese culture. For patrons, being seen in the company of a top-tier geisha like Monaco was about proving their status within elite society. The geisha's skill and beauty reflected the patron's taste, and their connection to a well-regarded geisha often elevated their own reputation among peers. The patronage system, however, had its own inherent tensions. While the geishas like Minako gained prestige through their relationships with wealthy patrons, they also had to negotiate their personal identities within the confines of the roles expected of them. As artistic performers, their value was tied to their ability to appease the emotional and social needs of their patron, while simultaneously maintaining the mystique and grace that the geisha identity demanded. The kimono, a primary symbol of their artistic profession, became a symbol of both achievement and sacrifice, representing both the success of their art and the emotional burden of living up to societal expectations. In the case of Minako Iwa, her rise to prominence in the geisha world was made possible through the patronage of the elite men who sought her company. Their financial support enabled her to flourish, but it was her ability to perform that secured her position among the most prestigious geishas in Kyoto. Through shamisen playing, dance, and graceful conversation, she became an indispensable part of the elite social fabric. However, Minako's success was not simply due to her skill set, was also the result of her relationship with patrons. These long-term patron-geisha relationships were mutually reinforcing. Patrons provided the financial foundation, while Minako's art offered them an avenue for social validation and emotional release. But as Minako's fame grew, the patronage system began to exert pressures on her that went beyond just her artistic ability. With each performance, Minako's identity as a geisha was shaped by her interactions with the elite patrons. This interdependence between artist and patron required constant emotional labor from the geisha, ensuring that the patroness' needs were met while simultaneously maintaining an air of mystery and professional detachment. For Minako, her art was not simply a means of financial survival, but a way to navigate the social currents of elite society to build connections, secure status, and ultimately define her legacy in the world of geisha. In the geisha world, the relationship between a geisha and her patron was far from simple. It was a complex, layered transaction involving both economic exchange and cultural performance. Minako's artistry provided her with financial rewards, prestige, and recognition, while also allowing her to cement her place within the highest echelons of Japanese society. But this exchange came at a cost: the emotional labor of constantly maintaining a mysterious persona, suppressing her true identity, and navigating the power dynamics inherent in her relationships with patrons. For patrons, their engagement with the top-tier geisha was both a sign of wealth and a symbol of sophistication. Their relationship with the geishas allowed them to demonstrate their refined taste while simultaneously fulfilling their own emotional and social needs. The financial and cultural exchange between geisha and patron was a defining feature of the geisha world, shaping the careers of talented women like Minako, while also reinforcing the social hierarchies that defined feudal Japan. Through Minako's journey, we gain insight into the interdependent and often complex dynamics between geishas and their patrons, where art, prestige, and emotional labor merge to create a world defined by mutual needs and unspoken sacrifices. This transactional world of the geisha underscores the dual nature of their existence, between the demands of their artistic careers and the emotional and psychological tolls of living up to the ideals expected of them. The geisha's life was a delicate and demanding performance of emotional labor, one that often went unnoticed by the patrons who admired their art. For Minako and other geishas, their primary role was not simply to perform art, but to serve as emotional companions in a highly structured society that demanded discipline, grace, and an idealized image of femininity. The emotional demands placed on a geisha were immense. Geishas were expected to be graceful, mysterious, and emotionally distant, all while being available to provide companionship and emotional support to their patrons. This role demanded a level of self-control and emotional suppression that was taxing on the geisha, while she was meant to embody an ideal of elegance, beauty, and refinement. The truth was that each performance required not just artistry, but also a complete repression of self. For Minako, like many geishas, this meant denying her own personal desires, feelings, and emotions. While her patrons came seeking art, conversation, and the illusion of intimacy, Minako had to carefully construct a persona that was ever present, ever available, yet never truly revealing. The emotional labor of this role meant that a geisha often became lost in the performance, required to give her all to her art while holding back her true self. It wasn't just about performing dance or playing the shamisen. It was about maintaining an aura of mystique, creating an emotional space that patrons could enter, but that she could never truly occupy herself. This emotional distance, paradoxically, was both her source of power, the element that made her so intriguing, and a source of psychological exhaustion. Minako, in her pursuit of perfection, had to reconcile the constant tension between the persona she projected and the individual she was beneath. In Minako's life, the art of being a geisha was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it allowed her to master traditional arts that were revered within Japanese society. She became an expert in shamisen playing, traditional dance, tea ceremonies, and poetry. Through this mastery, she was able to gain recognition and achieve a level of prestige that few could attain. However, this mastery came at the cost of her own. Every movement she made, every note she played, was choreographed, not only to display her skills but to maintain the illusion of the geisha's persona. While her artistry was celebrated, it was also bound by the role she was expected to play. The geisha was meant to be more than just an artist. She was a living performance. Each geisha was a carefully crafted ideal. She had to become this ideal without ever fully stepping out of it. This created a disconnect between Minako's true self and the public role she was required to play. The artistry that made her one of the most respected geishas in Japan was, in many ways, a mask. The more perfectly she performed, the more she had to suppress her own identity. As Minako perfected her art, the greater the internal conflict between the geisha she had to be and the woman she was beneath. The kimono, with its many layers and restrictive construction, symbolized this divide. The geisha was constantly performing an outward identity that hid the complexity of her true emotions. To maintain her professionalism, she had to keep her emotions buried, even as she channeled them into her performances. For Minako, this emotional disconnect was an inevitable consequence of her role. While performing, her artistry demanded that she embrace her emotions, but as a geisha, she was forbidden from expressing her true self. She could only channel her authenticity through her art, which left her feeling increasingly alienated from her true desires and feelings. This disconnect created an internal struggle. On one hand, she was a revered artist, admired for her skills. On the other, she was an individual who longed for freedom, for a life where she could express herself fully. The mental toll of constantly maintaining the geisha persona was often unrecognized, yet its effects were profound. For Minako, the need to maintain perfection in her art, appearance, and demeanor was mentally exhausting. The pressure to perform flawlessly, whether playing the performing dance, or engaging in conversation, was immense. Every aspect of her life had to be executed with grace and precision, a skill that required constant mental vigilance. The geisha's world was one of perpetual performance. It was not enough to simply perform. The geisha's persona had to be consistent in every encounter, in every setting. Whether she was engaging with patrons in a private tea house or attending a formal banquet, she had to maintain an image of elegance and mystique. The art of being a geisha was, at its core, an emotional performance, one where emotional control and distance were paramount. This mental exhaustion wasn't just the result of physical performance. It was also the consequence of the constant emotional strain involved in suppressing her own identity. While the patrons came to geishas seeking connection and enjoyment, the geishas themselves often had to shut down their emotions to keep up the illusion. The pressure to perform to give the patrons an experience of beauty and artistry without showing vulnerability was an incredibly taxing burden. For Minako, the mental strain of this emotional labor led to feelings of burnout and inner conflict. As she continued to rise to prominence, the disconnect between her personal identity and the role she played became more pronounced. She began to feel the weight of the geisha persona, which, while granting her prestige and status, also demanded the sacrifice of personal autonomy. This mental exhaustion wasn't just about the time and energy spent perfecting her craft. It was the emotional drain of being constantly vigilant, suppressing personal desires in favor of meeting the needs and expectations of others. The emotional labor required by the geisha system became an invisible weight, always carried but never seen. For Minako Iwasaki and other geishas, the cost of their art was not only physical but deeply emotional. The life of a geisha required more than just technical skill. It required the suppression of emotions, the constant performance of a carefully crafted persona, and the ability to hide the true self beneath layers of silk and social expectation. While Minako's artistry gained her admiration, her true self remained hidden, a mask of perfection that left her feeling disconnected from her own identity. The emotional labor that Minako and other geishas performed was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it provided prestige and financial security. On the other, It demanded the sacrifice of the self. The emotional disconnect that arose from living this contradictory existence led to mental exhaustion, self-alienation, and a sense of disconnection from authenticity. The geisha system, with its intense demands for emotional restraint, professionalism, and artistic perfection, left geishas like Minako with little room for personal expression or self-actualization. While their art was celebrated, the emotional cost of maintaining the idealized geisha persona was profound. It was this internal conflict of tension between the public performance of grace and the private struggle for authenticity that defined the emotional labor of the geisha. On the surface, the life of a geisha appeared as if it were a continuous performance of elegance, grace, and flawless artistry. Patrons saw only the finished product an evening of shamisen music, dances, and poetry designed to provide entertainment, artistic enjoyment, and social prestige. However, the public persona of the geisha was the culmination of a hidden world, one that demanded rigorous training, emotional suppression, and constant discipline. The geisha house, or okiya, where a geisha lived and trained, was a place of strict regimentation and mentorship. Behind the gilded doors of the tea houses and private performances, the daily life of a geisha was far from glamorous. It was an environment that demanded immense self-discipline and a relentless pursuit of perfection. The daily routines within the geisha house were marked by early mornings and long hours of practice. The younger geishas, known as spent their days perfecting their skills in shamisen, playing, dance, and poetry, all under the watchful eyes of their men. They lived in a community of mentors and fellow apprentices, where competition and cooperation coexisted. Each geisha's skill and reputation were not just personal achievements. They were tightly linked to the success and reputation of the entire okiya. Every performance was a testament to the years of work behind the scenes, where personal identity was often subsumed under the pressure to embody the perfect ideal of a geisha. For Minako, the public persona she perfected as a top-tier geisha guarded for her beauty, skill, and sophistication was a mask. The prestige that she brought to her patrons and to the geisha world was the result of years of sacrifice and emotional labor. While she appeared serene and flawless in public, her personal life was one of self-inyo, physical endurance, and constant, emotional vigilance. Behind the mask of perfection lay a world of personal struggle that few patrons, enamored with the geisha's art, would ever understand. In the okiya, the geishas were expected to be evident and constantly training their bodies and minds to meet the artistic demands of the geisha profession. The public image of the geisha was the result of a systematic process of personal sacrifice. The art itself required the geisha to constantly mold herself, her behavior, and her emotions to fit the ideals of refinement and perfection. To the patrons, the geishas were vessels of cultural beauty, but the reality was that this beauty was achieved through endless practice and a great deal of emotional suppression. The sacrifices made by geishas like Minako were not only physical and emotional but personal as well. To maintain the elevated role of a geisha woman revered for her grace and artistry, a geisha had to forego personal freedoms and intimate relationships. This was a strictly structured life where every action, every word, and every appearance was carefully orchestrated to maintain the illusion of perfection. For Minako, this meant that family connections were limited, and romantic relationships were largely out of the question. Her role as a geisha required her to live apart from her family, often separated from her parents, and to immerse herself in the geisha house, while her patrons enjoyed the company of a geisha, who was emotionally available in her performances. They rarely understood the sacrifices she made to maintain this professional identity. The geishas' private lives, their feelings, desires, and personal dreams were hidden from the public eye, buried under layers of silk, art, and decorum. Minako's emotional sacrifices were especially profound. As a top geisha, she was expected to provide not only artistic performances, but also emotional companionship, type of artificial intimacy that could never be truly reciprocated. Patrons expected the geishas to be attentive, gracious, and engaging without ever crossing the line into true friendship or romance. In exchange for status, wealth, and prestige, the geisha had to give up the freedom to experience life as an individual, disconnected from the demands of her public role. Romantic relationships were considered a distraction, and Minako, like many other geishas, had to suppress the desire for a personal connection that could challenge the world she inhabited. Instead, she lived in a world of emotional compartmentalization, where everything her heart, her time, and her energy was devoted to performing the role she had been trained to play. The geisha's private life, full of emotional complexity and unspoken longing, was often hidden behind the public performance. While patrons admired her beauty and talent, few could comprehend the emotional cost of a life spent in service to others. Additionally, geishas had to suppress their own personal desires, whether for family, romance, or freedom, in order to maintain their prestige in the geisha world. They were bound by the strict protocols of the okiya, where they were expected to conform to the demands of both the art and the patrons. As Minako's story reveals, even the best-known geishas were not exempt from the sacrifices inherent in the geisha system. In the context of her career, Minako's sacrifices were emblematic of a much larger emotional struggle that geishas had to endure. The very act of maintaining a geisha's role required the suppression of the self, and the more successful a geisha became, the more these sacrifices accumulated. For Minako, this meant denying herself the basic human experiences that many took for granted: the right to love freely, to live independently, and to make decisions that reflected her true identity. The geisha house was a world of hidden sacrifices, where the public performances that captivated the elite were the result of unseen and often painful labor. For Minako and countless other geishas, the price of their artistry was not just paid in hours of training, but in the loss of personal identity and the suppression of emotional needs. Behind the facade of grace, beauty, and perfection was a life defined by sacrifice and compartmentalization. While the patrons were enthralled by the geisha's performances, they remained largely unaware of the emotional costs that geishas paid in exchange for their art. For Minako, the personal toll of her artistic career was immense. She had to navigate the complexities of living as a cultural icon, while suppressing her own desires for freedom, self-expression, and personal connection. The sacrifices of the geisha system, though hidden behind a beautiful mask, were deeply felt, and the tension between the public performance and the personal self defined the emotional costs of being a geisha. Ultimately, the geisha's world was a place where success came at a significant personal price, one that could never be fully appreciated by the patrons who enjoyed the final product. For me, leaving behind the geisha house and embracing her true self was a rejection of the sacrifices that defined her life as a geisha, and a reclaiming of the personal identity that had been hidden for so long beneath layers of performance and expectation. The elite patrons of geishas in feudal Japan represented the pinnacle of wealth, status, and influence. They were members of society's aristocracy, including wealthy samurai, nobles, and powerful merchants, whose lives were filled with luxury, extravagance, and these individuals lived in worlds that were defined by privilege, where public performance, social gatherings, and pleasure were not only expected but celebrated. For them, the idea of entertainment was not just about leisure, but a cultural expression that served as a symbol of their elite status and refinement. The banquets they hosted were grand affairs, often marked by elaborate feasts, wine, and moments of artistic performance. These private events were venues for social positioning, where the quality of the entertainment, such as the geisha's performances, became part of the display of their wealth and cultural capital. Being able to invite or host a highly respected geisha was an undeniable symbol of their status, elevating them further in the eyes of their peers. In such settings, the geishas were not just entertainers, but living representations of cultural sophistication. These patrons enjoyed lives of freedom and they could explore their pleasures, pursue desires, and enjoy the comforts and luxuries afforded by their wealth, including enjoying the company of geishas who were there to provide not only artistic performance but also companionship. Their social calendars were filled with gatherings, where their social status was amplified through their associations with the geisha world. The geishas were an essential part of this cycle. They were the exquisite jewels of high society, the visible symbol of the patron's cultural and intellectual sophistication. But while patrons were granted the luxury of indulgence, the lives of the geishas who served them could not have been more different. Minako, like all other geishas, was trained from an early age to become a perfect performer, but her world was far from the privileges that the patrons enjoyed. The geisha's life was one of rigor, discipline, and self-sacrifice. It was an existence that required endless hours of practice, emotional restraint, and the suppression of individualities that were in stark contrast to the freedom that the patrons enjoyed. The public persona that Minako projected, one of grace, poise, and perfection, was a direct result of years spent in the okiya, under the watchful eyes of mentors and trainers who pushed her to reach artistic excellence. Yet, while the patrons looked, the geishas were bound by a rigid set of expectations to perform, to please, and to remain emotionally controlled at all times. For Monaco, and many others in the profession, the stark contrast between the lives of the patrons and the discipline of the geishas created a constant internal tension, one between the public ideal of a geisha and the hidden sacrifices she made to uphold it. At the heart of the geisha-patron relationship was a profound imbalance of power. Patrons, with their wealth and influence, held the keys to a geisha's success. They were the ones who could elevate a geisha's reputation, ensure her financial stability, and offer her prestige through their patronage. In return, the geisha's art, her musicianship, dance, poetry, and conversations served as emotional labor, designed to meet the needs and desires of the elite patrons. The patrons enjoyed the luxury of choice. They were free to indulge in art and entertainment, choosing which geishas they desired to spend their time with. In the world of geishas, the power dynamics were clear. The patron controlled the economic and social rewards, while the geisha was tasked with constantly maintaining her art. Her performances had to be flawless, her demeanor ever elegant, and her presence captivating. In Monaco's case, she spent years in service to these patrons, not only offering them the beauty of her art, but also her emotional attention, all while remaining emotionally detached and mysterious. She had to maintain the illusion of intimacy, without ever becoming emotionally available, offering only a performance of closeness. The geishas' lives, however, were dictated by the needs and expectations of the patrons. The patrons were free to live lives of luxury, pursuing their personal desires without the strictures that governed a geisha's role. For Monaco, as she became more successful, this imbalance became increasingly difficult to bear. The more prestige she attained, the more she became entrenched in a role that did not allow for true self. Monaco's art, a beautiful and refined creation, was constantly under the pressure of external judgment, expectations, and the need to please her patrons. Over time, this led her to question the value of her sacrifices, as her personal identity was gradually eroded by the demands of the role she had perfected. While patrons viewed the geishas as both status symbols and objects of desire, they rarely understood the immense emotional labor involved in their performances. The emotional sacrifice required from a geisha was often invisible to those who benefited from it. For Monaco, this became a source of resentment and frustration. Her art was praised, but her humanity was often ignored. The more she gave, the more she was expected to give. The patron-geisha dynamic was a relationship that demanded selflessness from the geisha, but offered little in return. This unequal exchange took a psychological toll, leaving the geisha with little room to cultivate her own desires and personal happiness. As Monaco's career blossomed, the emotional sacrifice that came with her geisha persona began to take a greater psychological toll. Patrons viewed her as an object of beauty and art, an elegant figure whose performances were meant to offer them escape and pleasure. Yet, for Monaco, the very art that brought her so much attention also demanded the suppression of her own desires. She had to repress her personal emotions to maintain the image of the perfect geisha, a woman who existed not for herself, but for the entertainment and pleasure of her patrons. This psychological burden was compounded by the patrons' sense of entitlement. They could consume her art, demand her emotional availability, and yet never truly understand the sacrifices she made to present that art. The more successful Monaco became, the more she was trapped in a world where she had to give her all while receiving little in return, at least not in terms of personal connection. She was a geisha ideal, a symbol of perfection, but that perfection was shackled by the demands of her patrons. For Monaco, and many others like her, the art she created came at a profound emotional cost. Her artistry, though lauded by patrons and admired in society, became a form of It was a form of emotional labor that she could not always escape from. The more she performed, the more she had to suppress her own emotions, creating a disconnection between her true self and the role she was required to play. The emotional toll of this sacrifice eventually reached a breaking point, prompting Monaco to leave the world of geishas behind. The relationship between the geishas and their patrons was one of mutual dependence, but also marked by significant emotional sacrifice for the geishas. Monaco's story highlights the psychological toll of being a geisha, where every act of art and emotional labor was an investment in maintaining a public persona that was constantly scrutinized by patrons. The patrons, with their privileged lifestyles, indulged in the art of the geishas, but were often blind to the emotional labor that went into the artistry they admired. As Monaco's career progressed, the power dynamics between the patron and geisha became increasingly unbalanced. While patrons enjoyed the luxuries of their social status, geishas like Monaco were expected to give their art and emotions, while sacrificing their own needs and personal desires. The constant emotional performance of being a geisha serving the patron's needs while suppressing her own authenticity was mentally and emotionally draining. Eventually, Minako realized that the cost of perfection was too great, and in leaving the geisha world, she reclaimed her own voice and identity, shedding the weight of the role that had both defined her public life and suppressed her true self. The geisha-patron relationship serves as a poignant reminder of the tension between artistic perfection and personal autonomy, highlighting the emotional labor and sacrifice inherent in the world of geisha. While the geishas created beauty, they often did so at the cost of their own emotional well-being, a paradox that Minako came to understand all too well. The geisha's role has long been a symbol of both mastery in the traditional arts and the sacrifice required to maintain that status. On the surface, geishas like Minako Iwasaki were revered for their artistic excellence, including their performances in shamisen, playing, dance, and tea ceremonies. They were the epitome of grace and refinement, shaping the cultural landscape of feudal Japan and beyond. Their role was, at once, both celebrated and highly controlled, their artistry representing the apex of elegance, while the personal cost of maintaining such a role was largely invisible to the world. The geisha kimono, with its beautiful patterns and intricate folds, was not just a garment. It was a representation of the geisha's artistry, a visual symbol of the perfection she was expected to embody. For Minako, the kimono became both a tool of success and a mark of her emotional confinement. As she wore the kimono, she was adorned not only in the beauty of the fabric, but also in the expectations and societal codes that the garment represented. It was a constant reminder of her role as a performer, and the demands of perfection that came with that role. The geisha's life, while seen as a pinnacle of cultural prestige, also demanded deep emotional and physical sacrifice. The years of training and discipline were grueling, but the emotional toll of living a life where personal identity had to be suppressed for the sake of artistry was perhaps the most profound cost. Minako, like other geishas, was required to present herself not as an individual with desires, ambitions, and needs, but as an idealized version of a woman who served serving patrons' desires, social expectations, and the tradition of her craft. Yet, despite these sacrifices, the kimono was also a symbol of the extraordinary mastery of the geisha's art. Minako's mastery in shamisen, playing, dancing, and entertaining her patrons was a testament to her devotion and dedication to the craft. It was an art form requiring the highest level of discipline, emotional control, and selflessness. The kimono, in this sense, embodied both the achievement of these ideals and the cost of pursuing them. Minako's decision to leave the geisha world in 1975 was not simply a personal choice, it was a profound act of liberation, one that symbolized her rejection of the societal constraints that had governed her life for so long. The geisha kimono, which had once defined her role and artistic identity, came to represent the emotional weight of the geisha system, a system that required not only the sacrifice of personal autonomy but the suppression of true self. By leaving behind the kimono, Minako was effectively reclaiming her own identity, shedding the layers of silk and societal expectation that had shaped her for years. This act of liberation went beyond just removing a garment. It was a reclamation of agency, a statement that personal identity could no longer be subsumed beneath the demands of others. In shedding the kimono, Minako not only left the geisha profession, but also freed herself from the emotional labor and performative roles that had long been expected of her. The kimono, once a symbol of perfection and status, now symbolized self and the heavy cost of living in a world that placed the public ideal above the individual's emotional truth. For Minako, this decision was as much about self-expression as it was about the journey from being a celebrated geisha to becoming a woman who could define her own narrative was a difficult transition, marked by both inner conflict and profound growth. Her departure from the geisha world was not merely an escape from a restrictive profession, it was a transformation into a life that allowed her to express her true identity free from the rigid expectations that had confined her for so long. Minako's legacy, both as a geisha and as a woman who chose to leave the tradition, offers a nuanced perspective on the role of the geisha in elite society. She was not merely a symbol of artistic brilliance, but also a symbol of the emotional cost of that brilliance. The geisha kimono forever tied to her legacy represents both the height of artistic mastery and the depth of self. The kimono serves as a dual symbol. It is both the public emblem of a geisha's artistic success and the personal symbol of the suppressed self. While the geisha kimono was a mark of distinction, it also came to represent the emotional labor of a life spent in service to others' expectations. The geisha's art was not just a gift, it was a sacrifice, one that required a constant balancing act between self-expression and the demands of a public image. In her departure from the geisha world, Minako Iwasaki carved out a legacy that was not just about her skill in the arts, but about her journey to reclaim personal freedom. Her decision to leave the geisha profession allowed her to write her own story, where her identity was no longer determined by the expectations of elite patrons or the rigid structures of geisha society. Her memoir, Geisha, A Life, is a testimony to the complex dynamics between tradition, art, and personal autonomy. It is a reflection on the conflict between artistic mastery, the skill and beauty she honed over decades, and the personal sacrifices made in its name. Her story reveals the emotional toll of being a geisha, a life defined by discipline, self-denial, and the constant performance of an ideal that often left little room for self-expression. The geisha kimono stands as a metaphor for the dual lives that geishas like Minako led public performers, yet private individuals with their own desires, dreams, and personal sacrifices. While the kimono was a visual representation of the geisha's identity, it was also a reminder of the emotional labor that went into the life of a geisha. The geisha kimono, in all its beauty, served to mask the emotional toll and personal cost of a profession that demanded perfection at the expense of the geisha's true self. Ultimately, Minako's journey from geisha to authentic self serves as a powerful reminder of the tension between art and identity. The geisha's role, though revered for its artistic and cultural significance, came with a cost that Minako, through her brave decision to leave the profession, exposed for the world to see. Her story shows that true mastery in the arts should not come at the expense of the self, and that personal freedom is the greatest form of self. Minako's legacy lives on in the geisha kimono, forever etched in the fabric of history as a symbol not just of artistic success, but of the emotional labor that made it possible. Her story, now shared with the world, continues to challenge the romanticized notions of the geisha life, offering a more complex and truthful narrative about the costs and sacrifices behind the art of the geisha, narrative that speaks to the unseen battles faced by women who lived lives defined by tradition and expectation, yet ultimately found the courage to reclaim their authenticity.